don't really know how to start this without it sounding strange, so I'm just going to start where it actually began, which is a lot more boring than you'd expect. Nothing dramatic kicked it off. No warning signs, no big decision. It started because I was bored, and because I had too much time on my hands, and because I didn't think any of it mattered. At the time, I was working from home full time. I'd been doing that for a while, long enough that the days had started to blur together in a way that's hard to notice until it's already happened. I'd wake up around 9, sometimes later, make coffee in the same mug I'd used the day before, still sitting unwashed by the sink, sit at my desk in yesterday's t-shirt and the joggers I'd slept in, write words I didn't care about for people I'd never meet about products I'd never use, close the laptop around 6, eat something microwaved while watching whatever Netflix suggested, go to bed, do it all again. Sometimes I'd realize it was Thursday and I still felt like the week hadn't properly started. Sometimes I'd go 3 days without speaking to another person out loud and only notice when my voice came out strange and croaky when I finally answered a work call. I worked in marketing, copywriting mostly, product descriptions, emails, landing pages, the kind of work that sounds creative until you're actually doing it. And then you realize it's just filling in the same template over and over with slightly different words. I wrote about kitchen appliances for a living, blenders, air fryers, coffee machines. There's only so many ways you can describe a blender before your brain starts to rot a little, before you catch yourself staring at the screen, trying to think of a synonym for powerful that you haven't already used twice in the same paragraph. I've been doing it for about 3 years, living alone in a 1-bedroom flat in Bristol that I'd stopped decorating after the first month. The walls were still that builder's beige. I had a sofa I'd bought second-hand that smelled faintly of someone else's life, a bed, a desk, a television. That was about it. I kept meaning to hang pictures or buy a plant or do something to make it feel less temporary, but I never got around to it. After a while, I stopped noticing. I didn't really notice how empty things felt until there was nothing left to distract me from it. My girlfriend had left about 6 months earlier, Claire. We'd been together for 2 years, living together for 1. She'd tried talking to me about it several times before she actually went. Said I'd become distant. Said I never wanted to do anything anymore. Said it felt like I'd checked out of my own life and was just waiting for something to happen. I remember nodding along, not really disagreeing, but not really doing anything about it either. When she finally packed her things, I helped her carry boxes down to her car. We hugged. She cried. I didn't. I went back upstairs and felt relieved that I didn't have to pretend to be present anymore. I told myself I'd feel worse about it eventually. I never did. One evening, sometime in late October, I was supposed to be finishing a deadline, a product launch for a new range of food processors. 1,500 words about 6 different models that were basically identical except for the color and the number of attachments. I'd written maybe 200 words in 4 hours. Instead, I was doing what I'd been doing more and more often, which was clicking around online without any real purpose. Articles, videos, forums, anything to avoid actually working. I'd start reading something about one topic and end up somewhere completely different 20 minutes later, without any clear memory of how I'd gotten there. Reddit threads about missing persons cases, YouTube videos about abandoned buildings, Wikipedia articles about cults, that sort of thing. Nothing out of the ordinary, just the usual internet rabbit hole. Somewhere along the line, I ended up reading an article about the dark web. I'd heard of it before, obviously, everyone has, but I'd never really thought about it beyond the vague sense that it was where illegal things happened. A digital underworld full of hitmen and hackers and things normal people didn't need to worry about. What struck me about this particular article was how unexciting it made the whole thing sound. It wasn't one of those sensational scare pieces you see shared on Facebook with headlines like, "What your kids are really doing online." It was technical, dry even. Written by someone who clearly knew what they were talking about and didn't feel the need to dress it up. It talked about privacy, about journalists in dangerous countries, about whistleblowers and activists and people who needed to communicate without being monitored. It mentioned the illegal marketplaces, the stuff everyone thinks about, but almost in passing, like they were an unfortunate side effect rather than the main attraction. The article kept stressing that most of it was dull. Forums full of technical discussions, lots of broken links, lots of text-heavy pages that looked like they'd been designed in 1998. I remember feeling oddly disappointed by that. I think I'd built it up in my head as this forbidden, dangerous place, all black screens and green text and shadowy figures doing shadowy things. Being told it was mostly boring felt like someone had taken the mystery out of it, like finding out that a magic trick was just mirrors and fishing wire. And instead of that putting me off, it did the opposite. It made me curious. I told myself I just wanted to see it. That was all. I wasn't looking for anything specific. I didn't have some secret interest I was hiding from myself. I just wanted to know what it actually looked like, the same way you might want to look at a building you'd only ever heard described. I'm not going to explain how I accessed it. Not because it was difficult, it wasn't, but because that's not really the point of this. The point is that within about 20 minutes of downloading the right browser and finding a working link, I was looking at a plain page full of links with vague names that didn't really tell you what you were clicking on. Free speech forum, library archive, privacy discussion, that sort of thing. At first, it was exactly as boring as the article had promised. Forums full of technical discussions about encryption and servers and things I barely understood. Long walls of text written by people who clearly spent a lot of time online and had strong opinions about things I'd never thought about. I clicked through a few, read a bit, clicked back, felt a bit stupid for expecting more, like I'd fallen for my own imagination. Then, almost by accident, I stumbled onto one of the marketplaces. If I hadn't known what it was, I genuinely might not have thought twice about it. It looked like a normal shopping site. Clean layout, white background, categories down the left side, a search bar at the top, little thumbnail images next to each listing. For a second, I thought I'd clicked on the wrong link and ended up back on the regular internet. Then I started reading the category names and the listings. I'm not going to describe what was on there in detail. I think you can imagine. Drugs, mainly. Pages and pages of them. Organized by type, with prices in Bitcoin and user reviews like it was Amazon. But there was other stuff too. Forged documents, hacked accounts, electronics that were probably stolen. Even some things I didn't understand at all, coded in ways that seemed deliberately obscure. I didn't linger on any of it. I wasn't interested in buying anything. I wasn't even tempted. I was just looking, in the same detached way you look at something you know you shouldn't be paying attention to, like watching footage of an accident or reading about a crime. What stuck with me, though, weren't the obvious listings. It was the ones that didn't quite explain themselves. They were scattered throughout the site, easy to miss if you weren't paying attention, tucked in between the obvious stuff. Titles like Specialized Delivery or Discreet Service, UK Only, or No Questions Collection. The descriptions were short and careful. A few lines about professionalism, reliability, discretion. Satisfaction guaranteed. No prices listed. No clear explanation of what was actually being delivered or collected. I clicked on one. The page didn't say much more than the listing had. It talked about moving items that required no documentation or tracking. It stressed that questions weren't asked about contents, as long as things were properly packaged and the dimensions were provided in advance. At the bottom was a contact link and a note. Payment required upfront. Non-refundable, regardless of outcome. That phrase stuck with me. Regardless of outcome. I read it 3 times, trying to work out exactly what it meant. Did it mean they might fail to deliver? Or did it mean something else? I hovered my mouse over the contact link for longer than I meant to. Long enough to feel my heart rate pick up slightly. Long enough to tell myself it was probably a scam, that anyone offering something like this so openly couldn't be serious, that this was exactly the kind of thing designed to prey on curious idiots. Eventually, I closed the page, shut the browser, turned my laptop off, went and made tea I didn't drink. I remember thinking that was the end of it, but it wasn't. Over the next few days, it kept coming back to me at odd moments, when I was supposed to be working, when I was making coffee, when I was lying in bed trying to sleep. That phrase, specialized delivery. I kept wondering what people actually used a service like that for. What kind of items couldn't be sent through normal channels? Whether anyone really responded to those listings at all, or if they just sat there. Digital storefronts for services nobody actually needed. I found myself thinking about it more than I should have, more than made sense. It wasn't that I wanted to use it. I didn't have anything to send, nothing that needed delivering secretly. But the fact that it existed, that someone was offering it, that there were probably people out there using it right now, kept nagging at me. About a week later, on a Tuesday evening when I should have been writing about the benefits of stainless steel mixing bowls, I went back. I told myself I was just going to look again, that I wouldn't click anything, that I'd just have another browse, satisfy my curiosity, and then leave it alone for good. But when I found that same listing, with the same vague description and the same contact link, I clicked it before I'd fully decided to. The messaging screen was blank. No name, no profile picture, no history, just an empty text box and a blinking cursor. I stared at it for a while, trying to work out what I could even say that wouldn't immediately make me sound either suspicious or stupid. In the end, I typed something neutral, something like, "Hi, I saw your listing. Could you explain a bit more about what your service involves?" Kept it vague, non-committal, the kind of thing someone might genuinely ask if they were curious. I read it back 3 times before sending it, then immediately regretted it. I didn't expect a reply. Or maybe I expected one in a few hours, or the next day. But 10 minutes later, a message appeared. It was polite, professional even. The kind of tone you'd get from a customer service rep at a legitimate business. It explained that they provided courier services for items requiring discretion, that they operated mainly in the south of England and Wales, and that payment was required upfront via cryptocurrency and was non-refundable regardless of outcome. There it was again, that phrase. I stared at the message for a long time. My hands were shaking slightly, though I couldn't have told you why. I hadn't done anything wrong. I was just asking questions. But something about the calm professionalism of the response made it feel more real than I'd expected. I should have stopped there. I know that now. But instead, I asked another question. I asked what kind of items they usually handled. The response came faster this time. They said they didn't ask about contents, only size and weight. They said items had to be appropriately packaged, properly sealed, and ready for collection. That was it. Nothing more. I asked if there were restrictions on what could be sent. They replied, As long as items are packaged appropriately and dimensions are provided, no questions are asked. I read that several times. No questions are asked. It was the kind of phrase that sounded reassuring, but felt wrong the more you thought about it. I told them I'd think about it and get back to them if I decided I needed their services. They said that was fine, to reach out anytime, and then the conversation ended. No pressure, no follow-up, no attempt to convince me, just silence. I closed the laptop and sat in the dark for a while. I wish I'd left it there. Instead, over the next week, I started looking for more listings like it, and I found them. Not hundreds, but enough to make it clear this wasn't some one-off amateur operation. Different sellers, different regions, but all offering essentially the same thing: discreet collection and delivery. No questions asked. Some even had reviews, though they were always short and coded. Reliable service. Delivered as promised. No issues encountered. The kind of feedback that told you nothing and everything at the same time. I spent hours reading them, clicking through profiles, trying to piece together how it all worked. Who were these people? Were they just couriers willing to look the other way, or something else? And who was using them? What were they moving that couldn't go through Royal Mail or DPD? I started imagining scenarios. Drugs seemed too obvious. Why would you need this when the whole marketplace was full of dealers who shipped things themselves? Stolen goods, maybe. Things too hot to fence normally. Or maybe it was legitimate things that people just wanted kept private. Documents, money. I didn't know. And then I did something I still struggle to explain properly. I created a listing of my own. If you'd asked me at the time why I was doing it, I don't think I could have given you a straight answer. Part of me wanted to see if anyone would actually respond. Part of me wanted to prove to myself it was all nonsense, that these were just scammers posting fake listings to steal Bitcoin from idiots like me. Mostly, I think I just liked the feeling of stepping into something different from my actual life, of doing something that felt like it mattered, even if it didn't. I spent almost an hour writing it, deleted it, rewrote it, tried to match the tone of the other listings I'd seen, vague but professional, enough detail to sound legitimate without actually saying anything concrete. In the end, I settled on something simple. Item collection required. Bristol area. Delivery to address provided after agreement. Item is appropriately packaged and ready for collection. Weight approximately 8 kilograms. Dimensions 40 by 30 by 25 centimeters. Payment can be made within 24 hours of agreement. None of it was real. I didn't have anything to send. There was no package, no address. I told myself that if anyone actually responded, I'd just ignore it or make up an excuse about it already being handled. I read it back one more time, cursor hovering over the post listing button. My stomach felt tight. My hands were definitely shaking now. I knew this was stupid, knew I was crossing some kind of line, even if I didn't fully understand what that line was. I clicked it anyway. Then I closed the laptop, went to bed, and lay awake for 3 hours. When I checked the next morning, I had 3 messages waiting. That was when I panicked. The first thing I felt wasn't curiosity, it was fear. Real physical fear that made my chest tight and my hands go cold. Because these were real people. They'd read my listing and decided it was worth responding to, which meant they thought I was serious, which meant I'd convinced them I had something that needed moving secretly, no questions asked. I didn't open the messages at first. I just stared at the notification number, 3. Such a small number, but it made everything feel suddenly, horribly real. I stood up, walked away from the laptop, made coffee, sat back down. The messages were still there. Finally, I opened the first one. It was brief and professional. They said they operated in the Bristol area and could arrange collection within 48 hours. They asked for confirmation of the exact dimensions and whether there were any special handling requirements. They provided a Bitcoin wallet address for payment and stated their fee, £400. £400. For delivering a package, I didn't have to an address that didn't exist. The second message was similar. Different person, slightly higher price, £450. They could do it within 24 hours. I opened the third message with my heart hammering. This one was different, longer. The tone wasn't quite as polished. They said they'd been doing this kind of work for 18 months and never had an issue. They said they understood that discretion was important and that some items required special consideration. They asked if the package contained anything that might be heat sensitive or time critical. Heat sensitive, time critical. I felt sick because I suddenly understood what they thought I was asking them to move. What kind of items would be heat sensitive and time critical? What would need to be exactly 8 kilograms and fit in a box that size? I closed the laptop so fast I nearly broke the screen. For the next 2 days, I didn't open it again. I didn't check the messages. I tried to pretend I'd never posted the listing, never contacted anyone, never even heard of any of this. I did my actual work, wrote bland sentences about kitchen appliances, ordered takeaway, watched television, and tried very hard not to think about the 3 messages sitting in my inbox. But on the third day, I checked again. There were 7 messages now, and one of them said, "Still available. Can collect tonight if needed." Imagine finding out that your home address has been circulating on the dark web for 6 months, attached to something you never agreed to, something you never even knew existed. That's what happened to me, and I'm still not entirely sure how to process it. I should probably start by explaining that I'm not someone who would normally have any reason to know what goes on in those hidden corners of the internet. I work in graphic design, mostly corporate branding and marketing materials. My technical knowledge extends to Adobe Creative Suite and basic troubleshooting when my laptop decides to act up. The dark web was something I'd heard about in news reports, usually linked to drug markets or stolen credit cards. But it wasn't something I'd ever had cause to think about seriously. What changed was a conversation I overheard at my sister's house last summer. Her husband works in cybersecurity, and he was telling someone about a case his firm had been consulted on. A woman in Manchester had discovered that her home was being used as a drop point for illegal goods without her knowledge. Parcels would arrive addressed to fake names, and before she could refuse them or return them to sender, they'd disappear from her doorstep. Someone had been using her address as part of a distribution chain. The story stuck with me because of how vulnerable it made the woman sound. She hadn't done anything wrong, hadn't signed up for anything suspicious, but somehow her address had been selected and used by people she'd never met for purposes she couldn't begin to understand. Her brother-in-law mentioned that these schemes were often coordinated through the dark web, where addresses could be bought and sold like any other commodity. I didn't think much more about it until a package arrived at my flat in Bristol 3 weeks later. Nothing immediately suspicious about it, just a standard padded envelope with my address printed on a label. The name on the package wasn't mine though. It was addressed to someone called M. Richardson, which wasn't even close to my actual name. I live alone in a converted warehouse building near the harbour, the sort of place that got gentrified about 10 years ago and now houses young professionals and small creative agencies. The postal situation has always been a bit chaotic. because the building was divided into flats without much thought for how mail would be distributed. We have individual letterboxes in the entrance hall, but delivery drivers often just leave packages in the communal area if they can't work out which flat they're meant for. This package had been left outside my door specifically, which suggested the delivery driver had made more effort than usual to find the right address. I assumed it was a mistake, probably meant for a previous tenant or someone who'd given my address by accident when ordering something online. It happens more often than you'd think. I left the package in the communal hallway with a note explaining it had been delivered to the wrong person, thinking whoever it was meant for would collect it eventually. When I came home from work that evening, it was gone. Problem solved, or so I thought. The second package arrived 4 days later. Same handwriting on the label, same name, same padded envelope. This time, I opened the main door to find it propped against my specific flat door, not just left in the general area. Someone had made a deliberate effort to ensure it ended up at my flat rather than anywhere else in the building. I called the courier company listed on the label to explain the mistake. The person I spoke to was polite but ultimately unhelpful, explaining that the package had been delivered to the address on the label and that if I wasn't the intended recipient, I should refuse any future deliveries or return them to sender. She couldn't tell me who had sent it or what it contained, just that their record showed successful delivery to the correct address. The problem was that the address was correct. My flat number, my building, my postcode, everything matched. The only thing wrong was the name, and apparently that wasn't enough to constitute a delivery error in their system. I put the second package in the hallway with another note, and again it disappeared by the evening. Whoever M. Richardson was, they were collecting these packages promptly and efficiently. The third package arrived a week later, and by this point, I was starting to feel uneasy about the whole situation. 3 deliveries to a non-existent person at my address suggested something more deliberate than a simple administrative error. I decided to open it, partly out of curiosity, and partly because I wanted to know if I was somehow involved in something I should be concerned about. Inside was a mobile phone, not a new one in retail packaging, but a used device wrapped in bubble wrap. There was no documentation, no SIM card, nothing to indicate where it had come from or why it was being sent to my address. Just a phone that looked a few years old but still functional. I turned it on, expecting to find something that would explain the situation. The phone had been factory reset, with nothing stored on it except the default apps and settings. No contacts, no messages, no call history. Completely clean. I should have gone to the police then, but I didn't really know what I'd be reporting. Someone was receiving packages at my address under a fake name, but they weren't causing any damage or disruption beyond the mild inconvenience of me having to move parcels from my doorstep. And whoever was collecting them was doing so quickly enough that I'd never actually encountered them in person. I kept the phone, more out of uncertainty about what else to do with it than any real decision to hold onto it. I put it in a drawer and tried to forget about it, telling myself that maybe the deliveries would stop now, that I'd intercepted one. They didn't stop. Over the next month, 7 more packages arrived. I didn't open any of them, but I could feel from the weight and shape that they contained similar items. Small electronics, probably more phones. Each one disappeared from the hallway within hours of delivery, collected by the mysterious M. Richardson, who somehow had access to my building. I started paying more attention to the other residents, wondering if one of them was behind the scheme. The building housed around 30 people, most of whom I recognized by sight, but didn't really know. Any of them could have been using my address as a convenient collection point, secure in the knowledge that I'd leave the packages accessible rather than refusing them outright. The paranoia crept in gradually. I found myself studying my neighbors in the hallway, trying to detect any sign of guilt or recognition when they saw me. I started varying my routine, coming home at different times to see if I could catch whoever was collecting the packages. I even considered installing a small camera pointed at my door, though I wasn't sure that would be legal without informing the building management. What really disturbed me was finding the listing. I was talking to a colleague at work about the situation, and she suggested I search for my address online to see if it appeared anywhere suspicious. I didn't expect to find anything, but she convinced me it was worth checking. I started with regular search engines, which turned up nothing unusual. Then she mentioned that the dark web might be worth investigating, if I was comfortable doing that. She explained that accessing it wasn't illegal in itself, and that I didn't need any special technical knowledge, just a particular type of browser that let you access hidden websites. I spent an evening reading about how it all worked, feeling increasingly out of my depth. The whole concept of websites that don't appear in normal search results, that require specific software to access, seemed designed to make people like me feel like they were doing something vaguely criminal just by looking. But my colleague had been right about one thing. It wasn't actually difficult to access, just different. I'm not going to detail exactly how I went about it, because I don't want to encourage anyone else to do the same. But within an hour, I had access to a search engine that indexed hidden websites. I typed in my address, not really expecting to find anything. What came up made my stomach drop. My address was listed on a marketplace, categorized under a section for verified drop points. The listing included details about the building layout, the postal arrangements, and specific information about my flat being suitable for collections. It mentioned that the current occupant was female, lived alone, worked regular office hours, and had demonstrated reliable behavior by leaving misaddressed packages in the communal area for collection. The listing had been active for 6 months. 6 months of my address being advertised as a safe location for receiving packages that couldn't be delivered to the actual recipients. 6 months of strangers on the internet knowing details about my life and routine that I'd never shared with anyone. The price for using the address was listed in terms I didn't fully understand, but the comments from previous users made it clear that my flat had become a popular option. People praised the reliable access, the quick collection times, and the lack of interference from the resident. Someone had even given it a 5-star rating. I felt physically sick reading through the comments. These people were discussing me like I was a service they'd paid for, analyzing my behavior patterns and noting when I was most likely to be home. One comment mentioned that I usually left for work around 8 in the morning and returned around 6 in the evening, which was accurate enough to suggest they'd been watching the building. Another comment noted that I sometimes went away for weekends, making those times particularly convenient for larger deliveries that might need more time for collection. The level of observation was deeply unsettling. These weren't just people using my address opportunistically. They were actively monitoring my routine to optimize their operations. I tried to report the listing, but there was no obvious mechanism for doing so. The marketplace didn't have contact details or support functions like a normal website. It just existed, hosting listings for dozens of other addresses across the UK, all of them presumably occupied by people who had no idea they were being used this way. I took screenshots of everything, thinking I'd need evidence when I reported it to the police. Then I spent the next hour searching for any information about M. Richardson, the name that had been on all the packages. Nothing came up. it was clearly a fake name, probably one of many used by different people to collect their purchases from my address. The worst part was realizing that I couldn't just stop it. Even if I refused all future packages, even if I put up signs or changed my locks, the listing would still be there. My address would still be advertised as a drop point, and whoever had posted it would simply update the listing to reflect the changed circumstances. The information was already out there, circulating in spaces I couldn't access or control. I did eventually go to the police, though I'm not sure it achieved much. The officer I spoke to was sympathetic, but explained that this type of situation was increasingly common and difficult to prosecute. Unless I could identify who was collecting the packages or prove that they contained illegal items, there wasn't much the police could do beyond making a note of my complaint. They suggested I refuse all deliveries not in my name and document any suspicious activity around my flat. The packages continued arriving for another 3 weeks, though less frequently. I refused every single one, handing them back to delivery drivers and explaining they were incorrectly addressed. Some drivers argued, saying their systems showed successful deliveries to that address in the past, but I stood firm. Eventually, the deliveries stopped. I checked the dark web listing a month later and found that my address had been marked as compromised, with a warning to users that the resident was now aware and refusing packages. The listing was still active though, still available for anyone who thought they could find a way around the new difficulties. I moved out of that flat 2 months ago. I know that probably seems like an overreaction, and maybe it was, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched and used by people I'd never see or identify. Every delivery to my door made me anxious. Every stranger in the hallway looked suspicious. I couldn't live like that. The thing that haunts me most is not knowing how they got my address in the first place. How did someone decide that my flat would be suitable for their purposes? Had they been watching me before the listing went up? Or had they simply found my address through some data breach and extrapolated the rest from public information? I think about all the times I'd left those packages in the hallway, trying to be helpful to someone I assumed had made an innocent mistake. I think about how my attempt to be a good neighbor had been exploited and turned into part of someone's criminal enterprise. I wonder how many of those phones I'd indirectly helped deliver were used for purposes I don't want to imagine. Sometimes I check that marketplace listing, even though I don't live there anymore. My old address is still active, marked as compromised, but still available for anyone willing to take the risk. The new tenant probably has no idea what they've moved into, no idea that their home is listed on the dark web as a verified drop point for illegal deliveries. I thought about contacting them to warn them, but how do you explain something like that without sounding completely paranoid? How do you tell a stranger that their address is being traded on hidden websites by criminals who've been observing the building for months? Instead, I've done nothing, and that guilt sits with me every day. I've protected myself by moving away, but I've left someone else to deal with the same situation I couldn't handle. The packages are probably arriving again by now, addressed to new fake names, collected by the same invisible people who know the building's rhythms better than most of the residents do. The worst part is knowing that it could start again anywhere. My new address isn't listed yet, but that doesn't mean it won't be. Someone, somewhere might already be watching my new building, noting my routines, deciding whether this location would work for their purposes. I've become hyper-aware of every delivery, every stranger in my new hallway, every package that doesn't have my exact name on it. I know this level of vigilance isn't sustainable, that eventually I'll have to trust that not everything is part of some hidden scheme. But I also know what I saw on that website, and I know how many other addresses were listed there alongside mine. We like to think our homes are private, that we control who has access to our space and our information. But the truth is that in the digital age, your address is just another piece of data being traded and exploited by people you'll never meet. Your home isn't just where you live. It's potentially a node in someone else's distribution network, a useful location in a supply chain you never agreed to join. I still have that first phone I intercepted, the one I should have given to the police but never did. Sometimes I turn it on, half expecting it to contain some message or clue about who was using my address and why. It never does. It's just a blank phone, factory reset and anonymous, exactly like the dozens of others that passed through my hallway during those months. But I keep it anyway, a reminder that the world operates on levels I barely understand, that my attempt to be helpful and trusting was exploited by people who saw me as nothing more than a convenient address. A reminder that sometimes the most frightening things are the ones you never see coming. The violations that happen in plain sight while you're just trying to live your life. My address is still out there, somewhere in the hidden corners of the internet, marked and categorized and available for use. And there's nothing I can do about it except hope that whoever lives there now is more suspicious than I was, less willing to leave packages in the hallway for collection, more aware that sometimes a simple delivery error is actually something much darker. I never thought I'd be the type of person to get mixed up in something like this. Most people wouldn't. That's the thing about curiosity. It starts innocently enough. A random link shared in a forum. A passing comment about the dark web that piques your interest. For me, it began with an article I read about internet privacy and security. The author mentioned Tor browsers and onion routing almost as an afterthought. I didn't even know what those things were at the time. I'm a network engineer by trade. My days revolve around making sure corporate systems stay operational, patching vulnerabilities, monitoring traffic patterns. Nothing extraordinary. Just another tech guy with a modest apartment, a decent salary, and too much free time on his hands. Maybe that's why I installed the Tor browser that night. Professional development, I told myself. Good to understand how these things work. The first few days exploring the dark web were disappointingly mundane. Forums discussing privacy rights, marketplaces selling things I had no interest in, dead links, slow loading times. It was like visiting the internet of the early 2000s, minus the charm. I was about to uninstall the whole thing when I stumbled across a thread discussing something called Red Rooms. The concept seemed absurd at first. Live streaming platforms where viewers could watch and even direct acts of violence against unwilling participants. Urban legends, I thought. Internet boogeyman stories to scare the uninitiated. Most people in the thread seemed to agree. They were myths, impossible to operate given bandwidth limitations and the technical difficulties of secure streaming. A few individuals insisted they existed, but provided no evidence, no links. Then someone posted coordinates. Not a web address, but a string of characters, numbers, and symbols that meant nothing to me. Someone else responded with a single word. The thread went quiet after that. I copied the string. I shouldn't have done that. Everything would be different if I had just closed the browser right then. It took me 3 days to figure out what to do with those characters. The solution came from an obscure subforum where users discuss cryptographic methods. The string was a key of sorts, one that had to be entered into a specific field on a specific site at a specific time. The kind of complexity that made me think there really was something to hide. I found the site. a blank page with a single input field. Nothing to indicate what it was for. No text, no images. Just an empty box waiting to be filled. I hesitated before pasting in the string. This was the moment I should have walked away. Something about the sterility of that page felt wrong in a way I couldn't articulate. The cursor blinked rhythmically in the empty field, patient, expectant, waiting for me to make a mistake I couldn't undo. The first sign that I had done something irreversible was the sudden change in my network traffic. I monitor my home network obsessively. Occupational habit. The data pattern shifted, connections multiplying through nodes I couldn't identify. This wasn't normal Tor behavior. My system was being mapped, examined, catalogued by something on the other end. Each packet of data felt like fingers probing through my digital walls, searching for weaknesses, memorizing the layout of my network, of my life. Then the page changed. A loading icon, a countdown timer set to 20 minutes. Nothing else. I waited, telling myself I could close the browser at any time. I didn't. The seconds ticked away, each one dragging longer than the last. My mouth went dry, sweat beaded along my hairline. Still, I waited. Some terrible gravity held me there, unable or unwilling to turn away from what was coming. When the timer reached 0, the stream began. The video quality was surprisingly good. High definition, minimal latency. The room shown was simple. White walls, concrete floor with a drain in the center. A single chair bolted to the floor, empty, waiting. The emptiness of that room hummed with potential violence. The drain in the floor promised the necessity of easy cleaning. The bolted chair spoke of resistance that needed to be overcome. A chat window appeared beside the video feed. Users with alphanumeric names filled the space with scrolling text. I didn't participate, just watched the conversations scroll by. They discussed preferences, made requests. Some offered payment in cryptocurrency. Others seemed to have credit of some kind already established. The casual nature of their communications made my skin crawl. The banality of their anticipation, the everyday commerce of atrocity. I should have left then, but a terrible curiosity kept me watching. In my defense, part of me still believed this was elaborate theater. Dark web performance art designed to shock and disturb. It couldn't be real. The alternative was too monstrous to contemplate. A door opened somewhere off camera. A figure entered the frame, face obscured by a featureless white mask. They wore simple clothes, black pants, grey shirt, latex gloves. Nothing remarkable or identifiable. They looked directly at the camera and held up a piece of paper with a string of characters. A verification code of some kind. Proof that this was happening now, not pre-recorded. The blank mask stared into the camera, into my eyes, as if the person behind it could see me watching, could identify me through the screen. The chat erupted with activity. The masked figure put the paper down and left the frame briefly, returning with someone else. A person with a hood over their head, hands bound behind their back. They were guided to the chair, secured with restraints at the ankles, wrists, and across the torso. The hood remained. The chat began specifying activities. I won't detail what was requested. I won't detail what happened next. I closed the stream after 3 minutes and 17 seconds. Not nearly fast enough. I uninstalled Tor, ran security sweeps on my system, and tried to convince myself I had witnessed an elaborate hoax. But the sound stayed with me, the movements, the knowledge that somewhere, in some hidden corner of the world, that room existed, that chair, that drain. 3 days later, I noticed something unusual about my home network. New devices connecting briefly, then disappearing. Strange traffic patterns in the early morning hours, when I should have been the only one active. Someone had compromised my security. Someone had access. The intrusion felt intimate, violating in ways I couldn't fully process. My private space, my data, my life, all exposed to unknown observers. I changed all my passwords, reconfigured my router, installed new firewalls. The intrusions continued, more sophisticated now, avoiding the measures I put in place. Whoever it was had considerable skill, or resources, or both. Each time I implemented a new security measure, they adapted, evolved, found new pathways into my systems. It became a game of chess where I could only see my own pieces, never my opponent's. A week after viewing the stream, I received an email from an address consisting of random characters. The subject line was the same verification code I had seen on the piece of paper in the video. The body of the email contained a single line about viewers becoming participants eventually. I deleted the email, reported it as phishing, told myself it was automated, sent to everyone who had accessed the stream. Nothing personal, nothing targeted. But my hand shook as I clicked the delete button. My breath came in short, shallow gasps. I knew. Some part of me already knew. Then the real messages started arriving. Direct messages to accounts I hadn't shared with anyone. My private phone number, my work email. All with the same theme. They knew who I was. They knew where I lived. They knew my routines. Each message included proof. A photo of my apartment building taken that day, a screenshot of my calendar, a list of my recent purchases. The level of detail grew more invasive with each communication. What I ate for breakfast, which route I took to work, how long I spent in the shower. The final message came with an attachment, a floor plan of my apartment with an X marked beside my bed. The message informed me that my stream would begin soon, and participants were already bidding. The clinical precision of the threat made it worse somehow. No emotion, no sadness, just process, procedure, industry. I went to the police, tried to explain without incriminating myself. They took notes, offered to send a patrol car by my building, suggested I was being targeted by standard identity thieves. They didn't understand, couldn't understand without seeing what I had seen. The bored expressions on their faces as I tried to convey the danger made me realize how alone I truly was. I stayed in a hotel that night, paid in cash, used a fake name, didn't bring any devices with me, just sat in the room with the chain on the door, watching the parking lot through a gap in the curtains. Nothing happened. No one came. Hours stretched into eternity as I waited for a threat that never materialized. Sleep came in brief, restless intervals, interrupted by the slightest sounds from neighboring rooms or the hallway outside. I returned home the next day, convinced I had overreacted. The apartment was exactly as I had left it. No signs of entry, no disturbance. I ran more security scans, changed the locks, installed a camera system. Life began to feel normal again as days passed without incident, but the normalcy felt thin, fragile, like ice forming over a dark lake. I went through the motions of my routine while constantly looking over my shoulder, checking reflections in windows, scanning crowds for watching eyes. 2 weeks later, as I was falling asleep, I heard a notification sound from my phone. A new email, the verification code as the subject line again. The body contained a link and words about my viewership making something possible. I didn't click the link, deleted the email immediately, blocked the sender, tried to go back to sleep. The darkness of my bedroom seemed deeper somehow, the shadows more substantial. My heartbeat echoed in my ears, too loud, too fast. Sleep retreated beyond my reach. That's when I heard the knock at my door. Not a pounding or frantic banging, just 3 measured, deliberate knocks. Professional. Patient. The sound cut through the silence of my apartment with surgical precision. My entire body went rigid, paralyzed by the confirmation of my worst fears. I checked the camera feed on my phone. No one appeared on the screen. Just an empty hallway. The emptiness seemed wrong somehow, unnatural, as if the space itself had been hollowed out. Reality thinned to allow something through. Another knock. Same pattern, same deliberate pacing. The sound seemed to reverberate through my bones, setting my teeth on edge. The empty hallway on my phone screen made no sense. The knocking made no sense. Nothing made sense anymore. I called the police, whispering my address, explaining there was someone at my door. They promised to send someone, asked if I could stay on the line. I agreed, keeping my voice low. The dispatcher's voice in my ear provided a tenuous connection to normality, to safety. I clung to it even as another set of knocks came. The knocking came a 3rd time. I moved as quietly as I could to the door, looked through the peephole. The hallway was empty, not just unoccupied, but empty in a way that defied explanation. The familiar corridor seemed distorted, stretched, as if viewed through warped glass. And still, no one visible who could be causing the sound. A 4th knock, right in front of me. Impossible, with no one there. The sound now originating centimeters from my face. I could feel the vibration of it through the door, against my forehead pressed to the peephole. A knock from nothing, from nowhere, from no one. I backed away from the door, explained to the dispatcher what was happening. They asked me to verify my address again, told me units were 3 minutes away. Their voice sounded distant now, underwater, unreachable. The connection failing as reality unraveled around me. The knocking stopped. My phone chimed with a new notification. A text message from my own number informing me they were already inside. The words glowed on the screen. Impossible, yet undeniable. The air in the apartment changed, grew heavier, charged with presence. No longer alone, no longer safe, never safe again. The police arrived 8 minutes later. They found the door locked, chained from the inside. When no one answered their knocks, they broke the door down. The apartment was empty, no signs of struggle, no evidence anyone had been there besides me. Just my phone on the floor, screen shattered, and a piece of paper beside it with that same verification code. The police report noted nothing unusual beyond an abandoned residence, a missing person case with no leads, no witnesses, no evidence of foul play. Just another digital ghost, forgotten as screens scroll to the next distraction. I'm told they're still looking for me, friends, family, co-workers. They've all received messages from my accounts saying I needed some time away, that I'd be back soon. The messages include details only I would know, use phrases and expressions specific to me. Perfect digital forgeries maintaining the illusion that I still exist in the world I once knew. They aren't from me. I don't know where I am. The room has white walls, concrete floor with a drain in the center, a single chair that I'm secured to. There's a camera mounted in the corner, its red light constantly on, watching, streaming. The light never blinks, never wavers. A mechanical eye broadcasting my existence to unseen watchers. Sometimes I hear notifications through the walls. Sounds like bids being placed. Sounds like viewers making requests. The same commerce I once witnessed now cycles back to me. The drain in the floor waits patiently. The restraints hold firm. The door remains closed but will open soon. I know what's coming. I've seen this stream before. The other side of the screen now. The other side of the mask. Participant, no longer viewer. If you're reading this, it's because someone wants my story shared. A warning, perhaps. Or an advertisement. The truth doesn't matter anymore. Only the stream matters. Only the viewers matter. Be careful what you look for online. Be careful what you allow yourself to witness. The line between viewer and participant is thinner than you think. A membrane easily punctured. A boundary easily crossed. And if you hear that measured knock at your door someday, don't answer. I've been thinking about whether I should tell this story or not. It's been 3 years now, and I still can't quite shake the feeling that talking about it might somehow, I don't know, reopen something that's better left closed. But I suppose keeping it to myself hasn't exactly helped either. The thing is, it started so innocently. That's what gets me. I wasn't looking for trouble. I wasn't trying to find something illegal or dangerous. I was just curious. Back then, I was working in a call center in Manchester. It was absolutely soul-destroying work, the sort of job where you watch the clock and every minute feels like an hour. I'd go home to my flat, microwave something for dinner, and spend the rest of the evening online. Not doing anything particularly interesting, mind you. Just browsing, really. Reddit, YouTube, the usual time wasters. I'd heard people talk about the dark web before, obviously. Everyone has. But I'd always assumed it was either completely inaccessible to ordinary people or just full of scams and FBI honeypots. Then one evening, I was reading something about internet privacy, and the article mentioned how easy it actually was to access. That surprised me. I'd built it up in my head as this incredibly complex thing that required specialist knowledge. Turns out it's not. There's software you can download, free and open source, that lets you browse anonymously. Takes maybe 10 minutes to set up, so I did it. Just like that. Downloaded the software, installed it, and suddenly I was looking at a completely different internet. The first thing that struck me was how amateurish it all looked. Nothing like the slick modern websites you're used to. Most sites were just black backgrounds with green or white text, like something from the early 90s. Lots of broken links. Lots of sites that wouldn't load at all. I spent the first hour or so just clicking around, not really finding anything particularly interesting. There were some forums, a few marketplaces that looked dodgy as hell, sites offering services I had no intention of using. It was simultaneously more boring and more unsettling than I'd expected. But then I found something called the repository. It wasn't advertised anywhere. I found it through a random link on one of those directory pages that list dark websites. The description was vague, something like curated collection of rare materials. No screenshots, no reviews, just an address. When I clicked through, the site was different from the others I'd seen. Still minimal, but cleaner somehow, more organized. The homepage was simple, a search bar and a list of categories. Things like documents, images, media, personal. That last one caught my attention. I clicked on it. A new page loaded with what looked like hundreds of folders, each labeled with just a date and a location. 2019 Birmingham, 2021 London, 2018 Leeds. I picked one at random. Inside were more folders, these ones labeled with what appeared to be initials. I clicked on one of those. Inside were photographs. They were just normal photos. Someone's birthday party. A woman in her 30s maybe, blowing out candles on a cake. A group of people laughing in the background. A living room decorated with balloons. The next photo showed the same people sitting around a dinner table. Nothing sinister, nothing obviously wrong with any of it, but I felt uncomfortable looking at them. These were private photographs, family photographs, and they were here on the dark web, organized into folders by someone who definitely wasn't supposed to have them. I backed out and tried another folder. This time, the photos were from someone's holiday, beach shots, sunsets, a couple in their 60s posing outside a restaurant. Again, completely ordinary images that had no business being where they were. I started clicking through more folders, and they were all the same. Personal photographs, clearly taken from people's phones or computers, uploaded and catalogued by location and date. The thing that really disturbed me was how recent some of them were. I found folders from just a few months earlier. Photos of children opening Christmas presents, a family gathered around a television, someone's new car. These weren't old leaked photos from some ancient data breach. These were current, fresh, ongoing. I should have closed it then. I knew I should have. But I kept looking. I started recognizing some of the locations. One folder was labeled 2022 Stockport. That's maybe 8 miles from where I lived. I opened it, and there were dozens of subfolders inside. I clicked on one at random. The photos showed a house I didn't recognize, but the area looked familiar. Someone's back garden, their kitchen, close-up shots of documents on their counter, a gas bill, clear enough to read the address. I looked up the street on Google Maps. It was real. The house was real. These were photographs from inside someone's home in Stockport, taken within the last year or so, and they were sitting here in this collection for anyone to access. My hands felt cold. I closed the folder and sat back from my laptop, trying to work out what I was looking at. Was this hacked phones, hacked security cameras? I'd read about smart home devices being vulnerable, cameras that people install to monitor their property but don't secure properly. Maybe that was it. Maybe this was just a collection of footage from unsecured devices. Still illegal, still disturbing, but at least it made sense. But then I made a mistake. I searched for my own area. I typed in my postcode, and a folder appeared. I stared at it for a long time before I clicked. My chest felt tight. The folder loaded, and there were 3 subfolders inside, each with a set of initials I didn't recognize. I clicked on the first one. The photos were from a flat I didn't know, showing rooms I'd never seen. Relief washed over me. It wasn't my building. I tried the second folder, same thing. Different flat, different area, but still within my postcode. The third folder took longer to load. When it did, I felt something drop inside my stomach. It was my building, my actual building. The photos showed the entrance hall downstairs, the one with the post boxes and the door that never locks properly. The next photo showed the stairwell, the one I walked up every single day, the carpet, the scuffed walls, the window on the landing between the first and second floors. Then photos of the second floor corridor, my corridor. My door was visible in one of the shots, right there at the end of the hall, exactly where it should be. I couldn't breathe properly. Someone had been in my building. Someone had walked up those stairs, stood in that corridor, and taken photographs. Then they'd uploaded them here. The photos were dated 3 weeks ago. I stood up from my desk and walked to my window. I lived on the second floor, facing the street. From where I stood, I could see the bus stop across the road, the small Sainsbury's local on the corner, the kebab shop that was always open late. Everything looked normal. A few people walking past, cars driving by, the street lights casting their orange glow over the wet pavement. Nothing unusual, nothing wrong. I went back to my laptop, My hands were shaking now, and I had to try twice to click on the next photo. It showed my door, just my door, a close-up shot, clear enough to see the number, clear enough to see the small dent near the handle where I dropped my keys once and chipped the paint. There were no photos from inside my flat. That was something. But someone had stood right outside my door and taken this picture. Someone had been that close. I closed the laptop. I didn't shut it down. I just folded the screen down and stepped away from it like it might bite me. I checked my front door. Locked. The chain was on. I looked through the peephole. The corridor was empty, poorly lit as always, the flickering bulb at the far end doing its usual stuttering routine. Everything looked the same as it always did. I didn't sleep much that night. I kept getting up to check the door, to look out the window, to convince myself that everything was fine. In the morning, I told myself I'd overreacted. So what if someone had taken photos in my building? It was probably just some creep with too much time on their hands, documenting random locations for reasons I couldn't understand. It didn't mean they were targeting me specifically. It didn't mean I was in danger. I went to work. I tried to focus on my calls, on the scripts I'd read 1,000 times, on the customers who were angry about their bills or their service, or whatever else they decided to complain about that day. But I kept thinking about those photos. I kept seeing my door, my corridor, my building. When I got home that evening, I checked the dark website again. I don't know what I was expecting. Maybe I thought the photos would be gone, that I'd imagined the whole thing. But they were still there. My building, my corridor, my door. I clicked through them again, studying each one, trying to spot something I'd missed before, some detail that might tell me who'd taken them or why. Then I noticed something. In one of the photos, the one showing the full length of the corridor, there was a door open, not mine, the flat 3 doors down from me. The light was on inside, and I could just about make out the edge of a sofa, a bit of wall, a corner of a picture frame. I didn't know who lived there. I'd seen the person a few times, a man in his 40s maybe, always wearing a suit, always in a hurry. We'd never spoken beyond a quick nod in passing. I went back to the main folder. There were those 3 subfolders, each with initials. I'd only looked at the third one, the one with photos of my building. I clicked on the first one again, the one I'd dismissed earlier. The photos loaded. A living room I didn't recognize, a kitchen, a bedroom. Personal photos on a wall, too blurry to make out clearly. A bathroom. Then a photo taken from a doorway, showing a sofa, a television, a bit of wall, a picture frame. It was the same flat, the one 3 doors down from me. These weren't just exterior shots. Someone had been inside that flat. They'd walked through it, photographed every room, and uploaded the whole collection. The other subfolder showed a different flat, somewhere else in the building. I recognized the layout, but not the furniture. Ground floor, maybe. I'd never been in any of my neighbors' flats, so I couldn't be sure. But someone else had. Someone had walked through this building, entered at least 2 flats, photographed everything, and uploaded it all to this site. I went back to the photo of my door, just the door. Nothing from inside. Why? Why photograph the interior of other flats but not mine? Had they tried and failed to get in? Had they not tried at all? Was my door just documentation, a marker, something to return to later? That thought sat in my stomach like a stone. I checked the dates again. 3 weeks ago. I tried to remember where I'd been 3 weeks ago. Had I been at work? Obviously. I was always at work. But what about evenings, weekends? I couldn't remember. My days blurred together back then. Call center shifts, Home, sleep, repeat. I could have been out. I could have been in. I had no idea. I started checking the site every day. I don't know why. Maybe I thought if I kept watching, I'd see new photos appear and I'd know something was happening. Or maybe I just needed to feel like I had some control, some awareness of the situation. The folders didn't update. The photos stayed the same. My building, my corridor, my door. Nothing new. But then, about a week later, I noticed something else. The main folder for my postcode had a new subfolder, different initials. I clicked on it before I could talk myself out of it. The photos showed another building, a few streets away from mine. Same setup. Entrance hall, stairwell, corridors, doors, close-ups of specific flats, and then interior shots. Someone's kitchen, their bedroom, a desk with a laptop on it, papers scattered around, all of it clearly visible. This was still happening. Whoever was doing this was still active, still going into buildings, still photographing flats, still uploading everything to this collection. I thought about going to the police. I really did. But what would I tell them? I was browsing the dark web and found some photos of my building. Would they even take me seriously? And what could they do anyway? The site was anonymous. The person uploading the photos was anonymous. There were no names, no identifying information, just initials and locations and dates. So I did nothing. I just kept checking the site, kept looking at those photos, kept waiting for something to happen. Then something did happen. I came home from work one evening, maybe 2 weeks after I'd first found the photos, and my door was open, not wide open, just slightly ajar, maybe an inch or so, enough that I noticed immediately. I stopped in the corridor, my key still in my hand, and stared at it. I knew I'd locked it that morning. I always locked it. I was obsessive about it, especially after finding those photos. I pushed the door open slowly. The chain was off. It had been on when I left. I was certain of that. The flat was dark except for the light from the corridor behind me. I stood in the doorway, listening. Nothing. No sounds. No movement. I stepped inside and turned on the light. Everything looked normal. My shoes by the door where I always left them. My jacket on the hook. The kitchen straight ahead, clean because I hadn't cooked anything in days. I walked through the flat slowly, turning on every light, checking every room. The bathroom was empty. The bedroom was untouched. Nothing was missing. Nothing was moved. But someone had been inside. I knew it. The door had been locked, and now it was open. The chain had been on, and now it was off. I checked my laptop, still on my desk where I'd left it. I opened it and checked the dark website. The folder for my building hadn't updated. No new photos. I checked the browser history. Nothing unusual. I checked everything I could think of, looking for some sign that someone had used my computer, but there was nothing. Then I noticed my bedside table. The drawer was open, just slightly. I never left it open. Inside was the usual nonsense. Old receipts, chargers, batteries, a screwdriver, some coins. I picked through it, trying to remember what had been there, trying to work out if anything was missing. I couldn't tell. It was just random junk, accumulated over months, things I'd thrown in there and forgotten about. But someone had opened that drawer. Someone had looked through it. I didn't sleep in my flat that night. I grabbed some clothes, my laptop, my phone charger, and I left. I stayed with a friend in Salford, told him I'd had a problem with the heating, and the landlord was sorting it out. He didn't ask questions. I spent the night on his sofa, checking the dark website every couple of hours, waiting for new photos to appear. Photos from inside my flat, photos of my bedroom, my kitchen, my things. but nothing appeared. I went back the next day. The door was locked, exactly as I'd left it. The flat was empty. Nothing had changed. I checked everything again. Laptop, drawers, cupboards, wardrobes. Everything seemed fine. I told myself I was being paranoid. Maybe I'd forgotten to lock the door properly. Maybe the chain had slipped off somehow. Maybe the drawer had been open all along and I just hadn't noticed. But I knew that wasn't true. I started keeping a record. I took photos of my flat before I left each day. My desk, my bedside table, my kitchen counter. Then I'd check them when I got home, comparing everything to make sure nothing had moved. For a week, everything stayed the same. I started to relax slightly. Maybe it had been a one-off. Maybe whoever it was had moved on to other buildings, other flats. Then I checked the site and found a new folder. My postcode, my building, new initials. The photos loaded. My entrance hall, my stairwell, my corridor, and then my flat, my actual flat, photos taken from inside. My living room, showing my sofa, my television, my bookshelf. My kitchen, showing the mug I'd left by the sink that morning. My bedroom, showing my unmade bed, the clothes on my chair. My bathroom, my desk with my laptop closed on it. They'd been inside again. While I was at work, while I was sitting in that call center reading scripts and taking calls, someone had been in my flat, walking through my rooms, photographing everything. The photos were dated from yesterday, the day before I found them, which meant they'd been inside while I was out. Uploaded the photos that same day, and I'd only just found them now. I looked at every photo carefully. In one of them, the one showing my living room, I could see my coffee table, and on it there was something that hadn't been there before. A piece of paper, white, A4 size, just sitting there in the center of the table. I walked to my living room. The paper was still there. I'd walked past it a dozen times since I'd been home and hadn't registered it. It looked like nothing, just a blank piece of paper. I picked it up. There was writing on one side, handwritten in blue pen, neat and careful. It was my address, my full address, my name, my date of birth, my phone number, my bank details, down to the sort code and account number, my email addresses, my passport number, everything about me, laid out in a neat list, written in handwriting I didn't recognize. Underneath, a single sentence. You should be more careful about your security. My legs felt weak. I sat down on the sofa, still holding the paper. Someone had been in my flat. Someone had gone through my things, found my documents, copied down my personal information, and left me this note. And then they'd photographed it all and uploaded it to that site. I looked at the photos again on my laptop. I zoomed in on the one showing the coffee table. The paper was visible, but the writing wasn't clear enough to read. Just a white rectangle sitting there. They'd taken the photo after leaving the note. They'd wanted me to find it. I thought about calling the police then. I should have called them weeks ago, but now I had proof. Someone had broken into my flat. I had the note. I had the photos. Surely that was enough. But what would the police do? The note wasn't threatening. It didn't say they'd hurt me or come back. It was just information. My information, yes, but nothing you couldn't find if you knew where to look. And the photos? They were on the dark web, yes, but uploaded anonymously from somewhere untraceable. What could the police actually do with any of this? I moved out the next week, broke my lease, paid whatever penalties the landlord wanted, and found a new flat across the city in Chorlton. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. I changed my phone number. I closed my old email accounts and made new ones. I cancelled my bank cards and got new ones. I did everything I could think of to separate myself from that flat, that building, that whole situation. For a while it worked. I'd check the dark website occasionally, maybe once every few weeks, and there were no new photos of my old building, no new folders with my postcode, nothing. I started to feel like I'd escaped it, like it was over. Then, about 8 months after I'd moved, I checked the site again. There was a new folder, new initials. I clicked on it without thinking. The photos loaded. My new flat, my new building, my new corridor, my new door. I slammed the laptop shut and haven't opened that site since. That was 3 years ago now. I moved again after that, obviously, and then again. I've lived in 4 different flats since then. I don't check the site anymore. I can't. I'm too frightened of what I'll find. The thing is, I don't know why they targeted me. I wasn't special. I wasn't wealthy or important or connected to anything interesting. I was just some nobody working in a call center, living alone, spending too much time online. Maybe that was enough. Maybe that's all it takes. I still think about those photos sometimes, all those flats, all those people, hundreds of them, maybe thousands, all catalogued and organized and uploaded for anyone to see. And I wonder how many of them know, how many of them have found their own photos, their own buildings, their own doors. How many of them are living with the same knowledge I have, that someone was there, inside their private space, watching and recording and documenting their lives. I don't know who's doing it. I don't know why. And that's the worst part, really. Not knowing if it's one person or many. Not knowing if they're watching me right now, or if they moved on years ago. Not knowing if the photos are still there, accumulating, expanding, or if the whole site disappeared the day after I last looked at it. All I know is that I was careful with my security before, and I'm even more careful now. I check my locks twice. I take photos of my flat before I leave. I keep my documents locked away. I cover my laptop camera. I do everything you're supposed to do. But sometimes, when I come home from work and unlock my door, I get this feeling, this sense that something's different, that someone's been there while I was out. I'll stand in the doorway, looking at my flat, trying to work out what's changed. And usually, it's nothing. Just paranoia. Just my mind playing tricks. But sometimes, very occasionally, something will be slightly off. A drawer not quite closed. A chair at a different angle. Something small enough that I can't be certain, but noticeable enough that I can't quite dismiss it. And when that happens, I don't sleep properly for days. I shouldn't be telling anyone this. Part of me thinks I should just close this document and forget the whole thing. But I can't. I haven't been able to forget it for 3 years, and I don't think I ever will. My brother disappeared in February 2023. The police did their investigation, filed their reports, and eventually the case went cold. Mum still puts appeals on Facebook every few months, sharing that same photo of him from Christmas 2022. Dad doesn't talk about it at all anymore. And me? I'm the only one who knows what actually happened, and I've never told them. I don't think I can. His name is Daniel. Was Daniel. I keep doing that, switching between past and present like some part of me still can't accept it. He was Danny to most people. He was 26 when he vanished, 4 years older than me, and we'd always been close despite the age gap. He worked in admin, nothing glamorous, and he lived alone in a flat in Reading. Ordinary life, ordinary job, ordinary bloke. That's what made it all so much worse, I think. How someone so normal could end up involved in something so horrific. The police released his flat back to us about 6 months after he disappeared. They'd been through everything, found nothing useful, and eventually they had to let us clear the place out. The landlord wanted it back. I volunteered to help Mum and Dad sort through his things because I knew it would destroy them to do it alone. What I didn't expect was to find his laptop tucked under his bed, password protected, completely missed by the police somehow. I know I shouldn't have, but I took it, slipped it into my bag whilst Mum was crying over his clothes in the wardrobe. Told myself I just wanted to see if there were any photos on there, maybe some memories we could have. But really, I think I was looking for answers, some explanation for why he'd just vanished one day without a word to anyone. Getting past his password wasn't difficult. He'd always used the same few combinations for everything, and I knew them all from years of him asking me to check his emails or his bank account when he couldn't be bothered. The laptop was old, probably 5 or 6 years at that point, and it took ages to start up. When it finally did, I went straight to his browser history. That's where it started to get strange. Most of it was normal enough. News sites, YouTube, his work portal, some shopping sites. But then I noticed gaps, whole evenings where there was nothing, no activity at all, which seemed odd for someone who spent most of his free time online. I'm not technical, but it struck me as odd all the same. Danny lived online. Even on quiet nights there was always something, a video, a forum, a stupid rabbit hole. Here there was just nothing. Long stretches of nothing. It felt intentional, even if I couldn't explain why. I found a folder buried in his documents called Work Archive 2022. Seemed innocent enough, except Danny was meticulous about keeping work stuff on his work laptop, never his personal one. Inside were just 3 files. One was a text document with what looked like random letters and numbers. No structure to it, no obvious meaning. The second was a bookmark file, but when I tried to open it, nothing happened. And the third was a small application I didn't recognize. I nearly deleted them. Nearly just closed the laptop and forgot about it. But something made me double-click that application. What opened wasn't anything I recognized. It looked like a browser, but stripped back, basic. There was a search bar and nothing else. No favorites, no history visible, no helpful buttons. Just this blank waiting screen. I sat there staring at it for a while, trying to work out what it was for. And then I noticed the URL bar. It didn't say anything normal. It was just a string of random characters ending in .onion. That's when it clicked, slowly and unpleasantly. I didn't recognize the address format, but I recognized the feeling of it, the wrongness. I'd heard about places like this before, in passing, in documentaries I half watched while scrolling on my phone. I just never thought I'd be staring at one on my brother's laptop, but I'd always thought it was just some exaggerated thing from crime documentaries, not something real people actually used. Certainly not something my brother would use. I should have closed it then, should have shut down the laptop and thrown it away. But I didn't. Instead, I opened that text file again and stared at those random characters. They were grouped in blocks, separated by line breaks. On a hunch, I copied the first block and pasted it into the search bar. The page that loaded was plain, just text on a dark background, links listed one after another with short descriptions. Some of it was what you'd expect, I suppose. Things being sold that you can't buy in normal places. Services being offered. But a lot of it didn't make sense to me. Just vague phrases and code words. I didn't click on anything, just scrolled down, feeling increasingly sick, wondering what on earth Danny had been doing here. Then I saw a link that made my stomach drop. The description was only 3 words. Escort Services, UK. I clicked it before I could talk myself out of it. The page that loaded was designed like an old classified ad site, the kind you don't see anymore. Posts listed by region, each one with a title and a short description. Most were London, some Manchester, Birmingham, a few other cities. And there, about halfway down the page, was one for reading. My hand was shaking when I clicked it. What came up looked like a profile. There were photos, though they were small and grainy, clearly taken to hide identifying details. A description that was clinical, transactional. Services offered, prices, contact information in the form of another one of those onion addresses. It felt seedy. That was the word that kept coming back to me. Cheap, miserable. The sort of thing you don't talk about. I told myself that was all it was. Something Danny had stumbled into because he was lonely and human. Not because it meant anything worse. Just Danny being a lonely bloke doing something he was ashamed of. But then I started noticing things that didn't add up. The photos, for one. When I looked closer, really looked, the backgrounds were all the same. Same walls, same furniture, same dim lighting. These weren't pictures from different people in different places. They were all taken in the same room. And the women in them looked wrong. Not wrong like obviously fake or Photoshop, but wrong like they didn't want to be there. Their eyes were flat. Their smiles didn't reach anywhere near their faces. I backed out of the page and went back to the main listings, started clicking through other posts, other regions. And the more I looked, the more I saw the same pattern. Same style of photos, same clinical descriptions, same dead-eyed expressions. This wasn't escorts advertising themselves. This was something else entirely. I spent hours down that rabbit hole, clicking from page to page, trying to understand what I was looking at. There were other sites linked from that first page, each one more disturbing than the last. One appeared to be reviews, people rating and commenting on experiences they'd had. The language they used was dehumanizing, casual, like they were discussing products they'd bought rather than people. Another site had requests, people describing what they were looking for in specific, horrifying detail. And then I found the messages. They were in a separate application on the laptop, something designed for encrypted communication. I almost missed it completely, but it was listed in Danny's recently used programs. When I opened it, there were only 2 conversations saved. The first was short, just a few messages back and forth with someone whose name showed up as a random string of numbers. Danny had asked about the reading post, asked if the person was still available, what the process was, whether it was safe. The responses were brief and businesslike. Instructions on where to send payment, how to arrange a meeting, what to expect. The second conversation was longer, and it started about a week after the first one ended. Danny's first message, in it, was a question. He asked if the person he'd met was all right, asked if she needed help. The response was immediate and aggressive, telling him to forget what he'd seen and never contact them again. But Danny didn't stop. He sent another message, then another, said he knew what was happening, said he'd seen the fear in her eyes, heard her trying to speak to him in a language he didn't understand, said he couldn't just pretend everything was fine. The responses got more threatening, told him to mind his own business, told him he had no idea what he was involving himself in, told him that asking questions was dangerous for everyone involved, including the people he thought he was helping. Danny's final message in that conversation was sent on the 9th of February, 3 days before he disappeared. All it said was that he'd kept a record of everything and that if anything happened to him, people would know where to look. I felt cold reading that. Properly cold, like someone had opened a window in the middle of winter. I went back through his laptop with new urgency, looking for whatever record he'd kept. It took me nearly 2 hours, but eventually I found a hidden folder, password protected, but using the same combination as everything else. Inside were screenshots, dozens of them. Pages from those sites, profiles, conversations, everything. He documented all of it, and at the bottom of the folder was a document, a letter I suppose, though he'd never sent it to anyone. It was addressed to the police. In it, Danny explained everything. How he'd stumbled onto those sites whilst looking for something else. Something he was too embarrassed to specify. How he'd initially thought it was just illegal escort services, nothing more. How he'd met someone through one of the listings and realized immediately that something was very wrong. The woman had been terrified, he wrote. Could barely speak English, kept glancing at the door like she expected someone to burst in. When he'd tried to talk to her, tried to ask if she needed help, she'd just shaken her head frantically and begged him to leave. He'd left, but he couldn't stop thinking about her, couldn't stop thinking about what he'd seen. So he'd gone back online and started digging deeper. I didn't understand it all at once. It was more like a pressure building at the back of my head, the sense that I was seeing the same thing over and over again from slightly different angles. He didn't call it a network at first. He kept using words like overlap and coincidence, like he was trying to talk himself out of what he was seeing. Only later did he start writing as if he'd accepted it, that the same names, rooms and faces kept resurfacing for a reason. Danny thought he'd worked out locations, addresses that kept cropping up in different forms, sometimes hinted at, sometimes almost spelled out. He wasn't certain. He wrote that more than once. But the patterns bothered him enough that he couldn't ignore them. He'd noted patterns in the posts, worked out which profiles seemed to move between different cities, cross-referenced reviews to build up a picture of who was running things. It was all there in his notes, detailed and careful and absolutely damning. The letter ended with him saying he was going to the police, that he'd gathered enough evidence, that he couldn't sit on it any longer, that someone needed to do something, but he'd never sent it. And 3 days later, he was gone. I sat there with his laptop on my knees, feeling like the walls were closing in. I knew what had happened. I knew it with absolute certainty. I don't have proof of what happened after that. I don't have a body or a confession or anything neat like that. But reading those messages, seeing how they changed once he wouldn't back off, it felt impossible to believe his disappearance was a coincidence. I thought about going to the police myself, thought about taking the laptop, showing them everything, making them listen. But then I thought about Danny's final message, about how he'd told them he had insurance, a record that would come out if anything happened to him, and how they'd taken him anyway. They knew he'd documented everything, which meant they'd come looking for it, looking for the laptop, the files, the evidence. And when they didn't find it in his flat, when the police didn't mention it, they must have assumed it was still out there somewhere, that someone had it. If I went to the police now, 3 years later, with this laptop and these files, what would happen? Best case, they'd investigate, maybe arrest some people, maybe shut down part of the operation. But the people at the top, the ones who'd made Danny disappear, they'd know where the evidence had come from. They'd know his family had been digging. They'd know about me. I thought about Mum and Dad, about how they'd already lost Danny, about how destroyed they'd be if something happened to me too. And I thought about the women in those photos, the ones with the dead eyes and the forced smiles, and how going to the police might help them, but might also make everything worse, might drive the whole operation further underground, make the people running it more careful, more brutal. I don't know if I made the right choice. I've questioned it every day since. I deleted everything, every file, every screenshot, every trace of what Danny had found, wiped the laptop completely and took it to a recycling center 3 towns over. Told Mum and Dad I hadn't found anything useful on it, just some old work documents and pictures of his mates. They believed me because why wouldn't they? But I kept one thing, just one screenshot, buried in an encrypted folder on my own laptop. One of the profiles Danny had documented, not because I know what to do with it, but because I couldn't bring myself to erase it all completely. Couldn't let what he'd found just disappear into nothing. Sometimes I look at it, not often, but sometimes. I zoom in on the faces in the background of those photos, the glimpses of rooms and windows, and I try to work out where they might be. I tell myself that one day I'll be brave enough to do something with it, to finish what Danny started. But I know I won't. I'm not brave like he was. I'm just scared. The worst part is the not knowing for certain. The police say he's a missing person, probably went off somewhere to start fresh, probably had some kind of breakdown we didn't know about. Mum half believes it sometimes, on her better days. Dad just looks tired whenever it comes up. And I sit there at family dinners, picking at my food, knowing they took him, knowing he's not coming back, knowing I could tell the truth but choosing not to, because I'm too frightened of what might happen. I see his face sometimes, in crowds or across the street, and my heart stops for just a second before I realize it's not him. Could never be him. Because wherever Danny is now, whatever they did to him, when they realized he was going to expose them, he's gone. Has been for 3 years. And the women in those photos, they're probably still there, still in those rooms with the same walls and the same dim lighting, still being advertised on sites most people don't even know exist, still waiting for someone to be brave enough to help them. Danny tried. He really did try, and it got him killed or disappeared, or whatever term makes it easier to swallow. I think about that last message he sent sometimes, about how he told them he'd kept a record, how he thought that would protect him, about how wrong he was. And I wonder if somewhere, in whatever hell they put him through before the end, he regretted getting involved at all, regretted not just closing that laptop and walking away like any sensible person would have done. I regret it for him. Regret that he had a conscience, that he cared, that he thought one person could make a difference against people who make other people disappear without a trace. But mostly, I regret being such a coward. I regret deleting the files more than I regret anything else I've ever done. Not because it haunts me, but because I know exactly why I did it. I tell myself it's what Danny would have wanted, that he wouldn't want Mum and Dad to lose both their children, that he'd understand why I made the choice I did. But I don't think he would. I think he'd be disappointed in me, and I think he'd be right to be. So that's my confession, I suppose. My brother found something terrible on the dark web, tried to do the right thing, and disappeared because of it. And I found the evidence that could explain what happened to him, maybe even help the people he was trying to save. And I destroyed it because I was too scared to do anything else. The police are still looking, technically. Mum still shares his photo. Dad still goes quiet when anyone mentions his name. And I still check the news sometimes, looking for stories about trafficking raids or missing persons found or operations shut down, hoping that somehow, without me doing anything, someone else will stumble onto what Danny found and actually have the courage to act on it. But deep down, I know that's not going to happen. Deep down, I know those women are still there, still trapped, still waiting. And I know Danny's gone, and nothing I do now will bring him back. I just have to live with that. Live with knowing the truth and doing nothing about it. Live with being the person who chose safety over justice. I don't sleep well anymore. I haven't in 3 years. I don't think I ever will again. Look, I'm going to be completely honest with you about what happened, because keeping it to myself isn't working anymore. I keep seeing their faces everywhere I go now, and I think you deserve to know what you might be walking into if you're not careful about your daily routines. It all kicked off when I spotted this detailed map of my walking route stuck to the community notice board outside Sainsbury's. Someone had been timing my movements down to the minute. I wish I'd just torn it down and forgotten about it, but I've always been too curious for my own good. The map appeared on the notice board outside Sainsbury's in Headington, where I do my weekly shop every Saturday morning. It was tucked between advertisements for piano lessons and lost caterpillars, drawn on ordinary A4 paper, but with an attention to detail that made my stomach turn. Every street I walk down, every shortcut I take, every place I stop to check my phone, all of it documented with timestamps that were accurate to within minutes. My daily routine isn't particularly interesting. I work from home as a freelance copy editor, so most days I only leave the house for a walk around Headington and South Park during my lunch break. It's the same route every day, starting from my flat on Osler Road and following a roughly circular path that takes about 40 minutes. I'd assumed it was such an unremarkable routine that nobody would notice or care about my movements. But someone had been paying very close attention indeed. The map showed not just my walking route, but also my behavioral patterns. Notes about which side of the street I prefer, where I usually stop to rest, even which benches I sit on when I need to take a break. There were observations about my clothing choices, the bag I carry, and the times when I deviate from my standard route. Most disturbing were the personal details scribbled in the margins. My approximate age, my living situation, notes about my apparent health and fitness level. Someone had been close enough to observe and document intimate details about my daily life, yet I'd never noticed anyone paying particular attention to my movements. I took the map down from the notice board immediately, but not before photographing it with my phone. Looking at it more carefully at home, I realized the handwriting included additional information that was even more unsettling. There were references to my work schedule, my weekend habits, even speculation about my social relationships and living arrangements. The level of surveillance suggested someone had been observing me for months, not weeks. They knew my routines well enough to predict my movements and had gathered enough personal information to build a comprehensive profile of my daily life. But why would anyone go to such lengths to monitor a freelance copy editor who lives alone and maintains a predictably boring routine? I spent the weekend trying to identify who might have been watching me, retracing my walking route and looking for vantage points where someone could observe without being noticed. There were several possibilities: windows in nearby houses, secluded spots in the park, even parked cars that might provide cover for surveillance. What I discovered was more disturbing than obvious watching posts. Several of the houses along my route had small cameras positioned to capture street activity. Not obvious security cameras, but subtle devices that could easily be mistaken for doorbells or decorative fixtures. Some were positioned at exactly the right angles to monitor the specific areas where I'd been documented stopping or resting. I started paying attention to other details I'd previously ignored. Cars that seemed to appear regularly during my walks, people who were often present at particular locations, even dogs that were walked at consistent times that coincided with my routine. What emerged was a picture of coordinated observation that involved multiple people and strategic positioning of surveillance equipment. This wasn't casual stalking by an individual with an unhealthy interest. It was systematic monitoring that suggested a more organized purpose. I tried to research similar cases online, looking for information about surveillance networks and organized stalking. Most of what I found was either obviously paranoid conspiracy theories or legitimate security advice that didn't match the sophisticated nature of what I'd experienced. But following various links and references led me into online communities where people discussed more unusual forms of surveillance and personal monitoring. Some of these communities operated through private channels that required special access methods to reach. Eventually, I found myself exploring parts of the internet that exist beyond normal search engines and standard websites. What I discovered was a marketplace where detailed surveillance information about ordinary people was being bought and sold. The platforms I accessed were carefully organized with different sections for various types of personal intelligence. There were categories for daily routines, work schedules, social relationships, health information, and financial circumstances. Each category contained detailed profiles of individuals who had been systematically monitored and documented. My own information was there, listed under a section called Low-Risk Targets, with a comprehensive file that included not just my walking routes, but photographs taken during my daily activities, detailed notes about my behavior patterns, and speculation about my personal circumstances. The file had been compiled over several months and included information I didn't even know about myself. Things like which days I seemed tired or stressed, how I reacted to different weather conditions, even patterns in my clothing choices that suggested my mood or health status. But most disturbing was the purpose of this surveillance network. The platform wasn't just collecting information. It was offering services to buyers who wanted access to specific individuals. Clients could commission detailed surveillance reports on particular targets, or they could browse existing profiles and select subjects who met their requirements. The services offered range from basic background research to what they called environmental access coordination. This included gaining entry to targets' homes during predictable absence periods, installing monitoring equipment, and conducting what they described as proximity engagement with subjects who remained unaware they were being observed. My profile had been marked as available for enhanced monitoring, with a note that my predictable routine and isolated living situation made me suitable for direct intervention services if required by potential clients. I was being offered as a product to anonymous buyers who could pay for increasingly invasive access to my private life. The pricing structure was sophisticated, with different rates for various types of access and interaction. Basic surveillance reports cost a few £100s, while residential access coordination was priced in the thousands. The most expensive service was something called subject acquisition, which carried a price tag that suggested it involved more than simple monitoring. Reading through client testimonials and service reviews, I began to understand the full scope of what was happening. Some buyers were using the surveillance information for traditional criminal purposes, identifying optimal times for burglary, gathering data for identity theft, or planning more serious crimes that required detailed knowledge of their targets' routines. But others had motivations that were more psychological than financial. They seemed to derive satisfaction from knowing intimate details about strangers' lives, from watching people who remained unaware they were being observed. The surveillance wasn't a means to an end, it was the end itself. There were discussions about clients who used the gathered intelligence for what they called lifestyle integration, gradually inserting themselves into their targets' daily routines through carefully planned coincidental encounters. They would position themselves along walking routes, frequent the same shops and cafes, even move into nearby properties to maintain closer observation. The goal seemed to be creating artificial relationships based on comprehensive prior knowledge of their target's interests, vulnerabilities, and daily habits. They could appear to be perfect matches for friendship or romance because they already knew everything about the people they were targeting. I thought about my own walking route and the coordinated surveillance that had been used to document my movements. Someone had paid for comprehensive monitoring of my daily life, and now they had enough information to predict my behavior and engineer meetings that would seem natural, but were actually carefully orchestrated encounters. But I also realized that the map posted on the community notice board wasn't accidental exposure of their surveillance activities. It was deliberate, a message intended to inform me that I was being watched and to gauge my reaction to that knowledge. They wanted me to know I was being monitored. This suggested that whoever had commissioned surveillance on me was moving to the next phase of whatever they had planned. The initial monitoring period was complete, and now they were testing how I would respond to awareness of their activities. I started paying closer attention to my daily walks, looking for signs of the coordinated observation I now knew was taking place. What I discovered was that the surveillance had intensified rather than decreased since I'd found the map. There were more cameras positioned along my route, more people who seemed to be present at convenient observation points, more vehicles that appeared regularly during my walks. Instead of being deterred by my awareness, they seemed to be escalating their monitoring activities. But there was something else that made the situation more personal and immediate. I started recognizing faces among the people I encountered during my walks. The same individuals appeared repeatedly, always in positions where they could observe my activities without appearing suspicious. Dog walkers who lingered in particular areas, joggers who maintained consistent schedules that coincided with mine, even people waiting at bus stops who never seemed to board any buses. They weren't trying to remain hidden anymore. They wanted me to notice them, to understand that I was surrounded by people who were watching and documenting my every movement. The psychological pressure was more effective than any obvious threat. Knowing that every step I took was being observed and recorded, that my daily routine was being analyzed and shared with anonymous buyers, created a level of paranoia that made normal activities feel dangerous. I considered changing my routine, avoiding the walking route that had been so thoroughly documented, but I realized that would only confirm their influence over my behavior. They would simply adapt their surveillance methods to whatever new patterns I established. Worse still, I began to suspect that some of the people I encountered regularly during my walks weren't just observers. They were potential clients who had purchased access to my surveillance information and were using it to engineer encounters that seemed coincidental. The friendly woman, who often walked her dog in the park, had started conversations that demonstrated surprising knowledge about my interests and daily schedule. The man who jogged past me at roughly the same time each day had begun acknowledging me with increasingly familiar greetings that suggested he knew more about me than casual observation would provide. Even shopkeepers and cafe staff seemed unusually interested in my routine, asking questions about my work schedule and weekend plans that felt more invasive than polite conversation. I was surrounded by people who knew intimate details about my life, while I remained ignorant of their true motivations for engaging with me. The situation reached a turning point when I discovered that my flat had been accessed while I was out on my daily walk. Nothing was obviously stolen or disturbed, but there were subtle signs that someone had been inside. Items moved slightly from their usual positions, doors left ajar that I always kept closed. Even the arrangement of papers on my desk altered in ways that suggested that they'd been examined and replaced. But most disturbing was finding additional surveillance equipment that had been installed while I was away. Small cameras had been positioned in locations where they could monitor my daily activities inside the flat. Not obvious devices, but subtle modifications to existing fixtures that would be virtually undetectable unless you knew what to look for. They had escalated from external surveillance to complete invasion of my private space. I spent the evening identifying and removing the monitoring equipment, but I knew this was only a temporary solution. If they could gain access to my flat once, they could do it again, whenever my predictable routine provided the opportunity. More troubling was the realization that they had probably been monitoring my online activities as well, which explained how they'd known I'd discovered their marketplace and understood the extent of their surveillance network. They were watching my research into their operations, monitoring my attempts to understand what was happening to me, possibly even anticipating my next moves based on the information I'd been accessing. That night, I found a message waiting for me when I returned from my walk. It had been slipped under my door while I was out, despite the fact that my building requires keycard access and my flat is on the 3rd floor. The message was handwritten on plain paper, with the same precise penmanship I'd seen on the surveillance map. The note was brief and matter-of-fact in tone. It simply stated that my research into their community had been noted with interest, and that my technical skills and attention to detail suggested I might be suitable for recruitment as a surveillance operative myself. They were offering me a position within their network, conducting monitoring operations on other targets in exchange for payment and protection from further surveillance of my own activities. The alternative, they suggested, would be escalation to what they called direct engagement protocols, which would involve more invasive monitoring and closer personal contact with clients who had expressed interest in my profile. I was being given a choice between becoming a participant in their surveillance network or becoming a more intensive target of their monitoring activities. But I knew this wasn't really a choice at all. They had demonstrated their ability to access my home, monitor my activities, and coordinate complex surveillance operations involving multiple people and sophisticated equipment. Refusing their recruitment offer would simply confirm that I posed a threat to their operations. The message included instructions for accessing a private section of their marketplace, where I could review current surveillance assignments and begin training in their monitoring techniques. I've been staring at those instructions for the past 3 hours, trying to decide whether cooperation or resistance offers any realistic hope of escape from their network. But I think the decision has already been made for me. Through my window, I can see at least 6 people positioned at various observation points around my building. They're making no attempt to remain hidden, clearly demonstrating that I'm completely surrounded by their surveillance network. My phone has been receiving text messages with updates about my activities inside the flat, proving that they're monitoring my movements in real time despite my removal of the obvious surveillance equipment they'd installed. And there are sounds from the hallway outside my flat that suggest someone is preparing to gain access again, probably to install more sophisticated monitoring equipment that I won't be able to detect or remove. I think I'm about to discover what direct engagement protocols actually involve, and why they were so confident that recruitment was my only viable option. The sounds outside my door have stopped, but I can see shadows moving under the door frame that suggest at least 2 people are positioned directly outside. They're not trying to break in, they're just waiting, demonstrating their ability to access my building and position themselves wherever they choose. The message is clear. I can join their surveillance network voluntarily, or they'll continue escalating their monitoring activities until cooperation becomes my only option for maintaining any semblance of normal life. I'm opening my laptop now to access the instructions they provided, not because I want to become part of their surveillance network, but because I've finally understood that resistance will only result in more invasive monitoring and closer personal contact with the clients who've been purchasing access to my private life. Sometimes cooperation is the only form of survival available. I should probably start by saying that I didn't end up in this freezing bedsit by accident. I've been wearing 2 jumpers most evenings just to take the edge off the cold, sitting here in this cramped little room, while I tried to make sense of how things went the way they did. I had a proper flat in Norwich not long ago, decent heating, a bit of space, a view over the park. But I walked away from all of that once I realized what I'd actually been part of these past 8 months. Most nights now, I sit with my laptop balanced on my knees, not typing, just staring at the screen, as I think back over the messages I read and the content I reviewed, all the tiny decisions I made without really understanding who was watching. I used to tell people I worked in content moderation, the harmless kind that keeps things neat and polite. Then I lost that job when the company replaced half of us with automation, and I took on something else that paid far better for what sounded like the same sort of work. It wasn't. And that's the story I'm trying to tell here. How a job I thought I understood ended with me hiding out in a cold room, wondering if the people behind it are going to come looking. I'd been moderating content for a social media platform for about 4 years, before the company decided artificial intelligence could do most of what I did for a fraction of the cost. One day I was reviewing flagged posts and comments. The next I was being told my position was being eliminated, along with 60% of the moderation team. I was 39 years old with a very specific skill set that turned out to be increasingly obsolete. The redundancy package was adequate but not generous, and I spent the better part of 2 months applying for similar roles. Most companies were moving toward automation or outsourcing to countries where labor was cheaper. The few positions I found wanted people with technical qualifications I didn't possess. That's when I saw the job posting on a remote work website. Someone was looking for experienced content moderators to help manage discussion spaces on privacy-focused platforms. The pay was exceptional, nearly £3,000 per month for what they estimated would be about 30 hours of work per week. They emphasized that they needed people who could work independently, make consistent judgment calls, and maintain strict confidentiality about the platforms they'd be moderating. I should have questioned why anyone would pay such generous rates for content moderation work when most companies were desperately trying to reduce those costs. Should have wondered what kind of privacy-focused platforms needed human moderators rather than automated systems. But I was getting desperate, watching my savings diminish while I sent out application after application with no responses. The application process was straightforward. I submitted my CV along with examples of moderation decisions I'd made in my previous role, explaining my reasoning and approach to balancing free expression with community safety. Within 2 days, I had a response requesting a video interview. The interviewer called himself David, though I suspected that wasn't his real name. He explained that their platforms operated in spaces where mainstream social media companies had limited reach, serving communities that valued privacy and unrestricted discussion. They needed moderators who could maintain order without being overly restrictive. People who understood the difference between genuine safety concerns and content that was simply controversial or unpopular. He was careful to emphasize that the work would involve reviewing material that might be disturbing or offensive. The platforms attracted people with unconventional views, and moderators needed to have thick skin and good judgment about what actually constituted a rule violation versus what was just unpleasant but legal expression. That all sounded reasonable to me. I'd spent years reviewing flagged content on mainstream platforms and was accustomed to seeing unpleasant material. I understood that content moderation required balancing competing values, and I was confident in my ability to make consistent judgments based on clear guidelines. David offered me the position at the end of the interview, pending completion of a brief training period where I'd shadow experienced moderators and learn the specific rules and expectations for their platforms. The pay would start immediately, and I'd be working entirely remotely using secure communication systems they'd provide. The training materials arrived via encrypted file transfer, along with login credentials for the platforms I'd be moderating. David explained that the platforms use special browser technology to protect user privacy, which was why they couldn't be accessed through normal internet connections. He provided step-by-step instructions for setting up the necessary software. When I finally accessed the platforms, my first impression was how basic they looked compared to mainstream social media. Simple layouts, minimal graphics, text-based discussions organized into topic categories. The interface reminded me of internet communities from the late 90s, before companies had invested millions in sophisticated user experiences. The content itself was immediately concerning. I'd been expecting controversial political discussions or conspiracy theories, the sort of material that mainstream platforms restricted, but that wasn't necessarily illegal. Instead, I found discussions about topics that were clearly criminal in nature. Detailed guides for exploiting various systems, conversations about targeting specific individuals, even exchanges about coordinating illegal activities. When I raised concerns during my training, the senior moderator explained that their role wasn't to judge the legality or morality of what users discussed. The platforms existed to facilitate free expression in spaces where government surveillance and corporate censorship couldn't reach. Our job was simply to enforce the specific rules the platforms had established, not to act as moral arbiters or law enforcement. The rules themselves were surprisingly specific. No spam or commercial advertising, no revealing personal information about other users without permission, no coordinating attacks against the platforms themselves or their administrators. But almost everything else was permitted, including discussions of criminal activity, as long as they remained theoretical rather than active coordination. I was deeply uncomfortable with the distinction they were drawing, but the senior moderator emphasized that moderators who couldn't maintain professional distance from disturbing content wouldn't last long in the role. This work required accepting that facilitating free expression sometimes meant allowing discussions we personally found abhorrent. I convinced myself this was no different from the principle that defending free speech sometimes means protecting speech we disagree with. I wasn't endorsing what users discussed, just maintaining spaces where they could express themselves without censorship. My role was technical and professional, not moral or legal. The first few weeks of actual moderation work tested that rationalization severely. I reviewed hundreds of flagged posts and comments every day, making decisions about whether they violated the platform's specific rules. Most of the time, the violations were clear: spam, personal information being shared, direct threats against platform administrators. But I was also seeing content that was deeply disturbing. Detailed discussions about exploiting vulnerable people, guides for circumventing security measures and accessing systems without authorization, conversations about targeting specific individuals for harassment or worse, all technically within the platform's rules because they remained theoretical discussions rather than active coordination. I found myself removing spam and commercial advertising while allowing posts that discuss criminal activity in disturbingly specific detail. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. but I kept telling myself I was just following the rules I'd been hired to enforce. I wasn't responsible for what users chose to discuss within those parameters. The breakthrough came about 3 months into the work when I recognized specific details in a discussion thread. Users were discussing a harassment campaign against a teacher in Norfolk, sharing her work address, her daily routine, even photographs of her home and car. The post technically didn't violate platform rules because they weren't coordinating attacks, just sharing information and discussing theoretical approaches. But I recognized the school mentioned in the discussion. It was where my sister's children attended, in a small town outside Kings Lynn. The teacher being discussed was someone I'd met at school events, a kind woman who taught primary school children, and had never done anything to warrant the obsessive documentation these users were compiling. I realized I was moderating platforms that facilitated systematic harassment and stalking of real people, including people I knew personally. The theoretical discussions I was allowing weren't abstract debates about controversial topics. They were planning and intelligence gathering for criminal activity against identifiable individuals. I tried reporting the harassment campaign to David, explaining that users were clearly coordinating activity that would result in real harm to a specific person. He thanked me for the report, but explained that unless users explicitly coordinated illegal actions in their posts, the discussions fell within allowed parameters. The platforms existed to facilitate free expression, even when that expression involved sharing information about people who hadn't consented to being discussed. That response made me understand I wasn't moderating online communities to protect users from harm. I was maintaining spaces where people planned and coordinated criminal activity against vulnerable targets. The free expression we were facilitating was actually systematic intelligence gathering and harassment that destroyed real people's lives. I started paying closer attention to the platforms I was moderating, looking beyond individual rule violations to understand the broader context of what users were discussing. What I found was horrifying in its scope and organization. The platforms hosted extensive discussions about identifying vulnerable targets for various types of exploitation. Users shared techniques for surveillance, advice on circumventing security measures, even guides for psychologically manipulating specific types of victims. They coordinated activities without explicitly stating their criminal nature, using coded language and theoretical framing that technically didn't violate platform rules. One category of discussions focused on identifying and exploiting elderly people living alone. Users shared information about specific individuals, photographs of their homes, details about their daily routines. They discussed theoretical approaches for gaining access to properties, theoretical techniques for convincing people to provide financial information or access to their accounts. Another section dealt with targeting children through online spaces. Users shared information about children's social media accounts, their schools, their after-school activities. They discussed theoretical approaches for establishing contact, theoretical techniques for building trust with young people who might be isolated or vulnerable. I was looking at what amounted to criminal planning being conducted in plain sight, shielded by the pretense that these were merely theoretical discussions protected by principles of free expression. And I was the one ensuring these discussions could continue by removing spam and obvious rule violations, while allowing the substantive criminal content to remain. The teacher my sister knew was just one of hundreds of people being systematically targeted through discussions on the platforms I moderated. Each day, I reviewed posts documenting surveillance of specific individuals, sharing their personal information, discussing approaches for exploiting their vulnerabilities. But what made it unbearable was understanding that my moderation work was essential to the platform's operation. The constant spam, scams, and obvious rule violations would have made the platforms unusable if moderators like me weren't filtering them out. By removing the noise, I was making it easier for users to conduct their targeted harassment and criminal planning without distraction. I tried to refuse further work, but David made it clear that wasn't an option I could simply choose. I'd been working for the platforms for months, seeing everything users discussed, making decisions about what content should remain visible. I knew too much about how they operated and what they facilitated. Walking away would mean explaining to potential future employers why I'd left such well-paid work, and it would mean losing the substantial income I'd become dependent on. I was trapped by my own complicity. I couldn't report the platforms to authorities without admitting I'd been enabling criminal activity for months. I couldn't continue moderating without accepting that I was facilitating serious harm to real people. And I couldn't simply walk away without consequences from people who had extensive documentation of my involvement in maintaining these spaces. That's when I started documenting everything I saw on the platforms, taking screenshots and keeping detailed records of the criminal discussions I was being required to allow. I told myself I was preserving evidence for eventual reporting to authorities, but really I was just trying to feel less guilty about the harm I was enabling every day. The teacher in Norfolk ended up leaving her job after the harassment became unbearable. Users on the platform celebrated their successful campaign, discussing techniques they'd used and sharing lessons learned for future targeting. I read those celebration posts and knew I'd played a role in destroying a good person's career and sense of safety. I found other cases where people I'd allowed to be discussed on the platforms had subsequently been victimized. An elderly man in Somerset, whose information had been shared in those targeting discussions, was burgled shortly afterwards. A young mother in Wales, who'd been identified as vulnerable on the platforms, experienced systematic harassment that drove her from her home. Each case made it clearer that my moderation work wasn't just facilitating abstract discussions. It was enabling real criminal activity that destroyed real lives. The theoretical framing users employed to avoid explicit rule violations was just a linguistic shield that let them coordinate actual crimes, while I helpfully removed the spam and obvious violations that might have interfered with their planning. I tried contacting the police about what I'd discovered, but explaining my role proved impossible without admitting extensive complicity. I'd been moderating platforms for months, carefully removing content that violated specific rules while allowing criminal planning to continue unimpeded. My screenshots and documentation showed my intimate involvement in maintaining spaces where serious crimes were coordinated. The officer I spoke to was professional but frank about my position. I'd knowingly worked for platforms facilitating criminal activity. Accepting substantial payment for work I must have understood was enabling harm. Cooperation might be valuable for their investigation, but I shouldn't expect immunity from prosecution for my role in the operation. I was advised to stop moderating immediately and refuse further contact with the platform administrators. But David had already anticipated that possibility. I received messages explaining that moderators who caused problems for the platforms faced serious consequences. They had extensive records of my moderation decisions, including content I'd allowed to remain that had subsequently enabled criminal activity. If I tried to report them, they'd ensure authorities understood my active role in facilitating that activity. I realized I was being blackmailed with documentation of my own moderation work. Even though I'd been following the rules I'd been hired to enforce, the records showed me making decisions that allowed criminal planning to continue. They could present me as an active facilitator of the harm these platforms enabled. That's when the harassment started in earnest. I began finding my own personal information appearing on the platforms I'd been moderating. Users discussed my work history, my address, my daily routines. They shared photographs of my flat taken from outside, discussed theoretical approaches for accessing my home, even speculated about vulnerabilities that could be exploited. I was now being subjected to the same treatment I'd been enabling for months through my moderation work. Users were documenting my life with the same methodical precision they'd applied to all their previous targets, discussing approaches for ensuring my silence about what I'd seen on their platforms. The cognitive dissonance of seeing my own information being shared in spaces I was supposed to be moderating was overwhelming. I was expected to continue removing spam and obvious rule violations from discussions about targeting me, maintaining the platform's functionality, even as it facilitated my own harassment. I stopped logging into the moderation systems entirely, knowing that refusing to work would trigger the consequences David had warned about, but unable to continue enabling discussions that now directly threaten my own safety. Within days, I started receiving packages containing printed screenshots of moderation decisions I'd made, with annotations showing how those decisions had enabled specific criminal activities. The message was clear. They had comprehensive documentation of my complicity, and they'd use it to destroy my life if I caused them problems by reporting to authorities or refusing to remain silent about what I'd seen. That's when I left Norwich entirely, packing essential belongings and driving to Stoke-on-Trent, where I had no previous connections. I've been staying in this inadequate bedsit, avoiding digital traces and hoping I can disappear long enough to work out what to do next. But I know the platforms are still operating, still facilitating criminal planning and coordination, still enabling systematic targeting of vulnerable people. Other moderators have probably been recruited to replace me. People who make the same rationalizations I did about just enforcing rules and maintaining free expression. I think about that teacher in Norfolk, about the elderly man who was burgled, about all the other people whose lives were destroyed through discussions I allowed to remain visible. They trusted that online platforms had some responsibility to prevent coordination of criminal activity, that moderators would remove content that enabled serious harm. But I proved them wrong by carefully maintaining the platform's functionality, while allowing criminal planning to continue unimpeded. Every spam post I removed, every obvious violation I caught, it all made the platforms more effective at facilitating the criminal discussions I was required to ignore. The platforms taught me that moderation itself can be weaponized, that enforcing narrow technical rules while ignoring broader criminal context makes you complicit in whatever harm those platforms enable, that free expression principles can be exploited to shield criminal activity behind theoretical framing and coded language, and that once you've spent months moderating platforms you know are facilitating criminal activity, you become complicit enough that reporting them means destroying your own life along with exposing their operations. I suppose that's why I'm still sitting here in this freezing bedsit, rather than going back to police with all the evidence I preserved. Because I know that documentation implicates me as much as it exposes the platforms, and I'm not brave enough to face consequences for choices I made when I convinced myself I was just following the rules I'd been hired to enforce. All I can do is hope that someone else will eventually expose these platforms, that other moderators will find the courage I lack to report what they're enabling, despite the personal consequences, and hope that the people being targeted through discussions on those platforms find some way to protect themselves from criminal activity being coordinated in spaces that present themselves as merely facilitating controversial free expression. Because the platforms are still operating, still recruiting moderators, still facilitating systematic targeting of vulnerable people. And I helped maintain them for months. carefully removing spam and obvious violations, while allowing criminal planning to flourish unchecked. Have you ever been in the situation where you do something seemingly normal, something routine, and it completely changes your life? I'm curious, what would you do if you took your laptop in for a simple repair and end up discovering that the ordinary-looking guy in the computer shop is involved in things that would make your worst nightmares seem tame? That the person fixing your webcam issue has been using that same webcam to watch you for months? I work as a teaching assistant at a primary school in Coventry. There's nothing particularly exciting about my life. I help 7-year-olds with their reading, supervise playtime, and assist the main teachers with various administrative tasks. The pay isn't brilliant, but I enjoy working with children and the holidays are decent. Last autumn, my laptop started acting up. The webcam would activate randomly, the little green light flickering on for a few seconds before switching off again. Sometimes I'd catch it happening while I was using the computer. Other times I'd notice it had been on when I returned from making tea or using the bathroom. Initially, I assumed it was a software glitch, ran virus scans, updated drivers, tried all the usual troubleshooting steps you find online. Nothing worked. If anything, the problem seemed to be getting worse. The camera would activate more frequently, sometimes staying on for several minutes at a time. Eventually, I decided to take it to a local repair shop. The place was called Digital Solutions and occupied a narrow storefront between a charity shop and a kebab restaurant. I'd walked past it hundreds of times but never really noticed it before. The kind of business that blends into the background of everyday urban life. The owner was a middle-aged man named Trevor, who seemed knowledgeable about computers and quoted reasonable prices for the repair work. He explained that webcam issues were common, usually caused by corrupted drivers or malware infections. Said he'd need to keep the laptop for a few days to run comprehensive diagnostics and clean up the system. I dropped it off on a Wednesday morning and was told it would be ready by the weekend. Trevor provided a receipt and assured me that all customer data would remain private and secure during the repair process. That evening, I realized how much I relied on my laptop for basic activities, checking emails, browsing social media, watching streaming services before bed. Without it, I found myself with unexpectedly free time and nothing particular to do with it. On Thursday evening, I decided to walk past the shop to see if it was still open. The storefront was dark, but I could see light coming from what appeared to be a back office or workshop area. Trevor was working late, presumably fixing computers like mine. As I walked past, something caught my attention. Through the window, I could see multiple computer screens displaying what looked like video feeds. Not the typical desktop view you'd expect from computer repair work, but actual video streams showing various rooms and locations. I slowed down to get a better look, trying to appear casual while examining what was visible through the window. The video feeds showed different domestic spaces, bedrooms, living rooms, home offices. Most appeared to be empty, though a few showed people going about their normal evening routines. My first thought was that Trevor might be running some sort of security monitoring service alongside his computer repair business. Many small business owners take on multiple revenue streams to make ends meet. Nothing particularly suspicious about that. But something felt off about what I was seeing. The camera angles were wrong for professional security installations. Too intimate, too focused on private spaces rather than entry points or valuable items. These looked more like hidden cameras than security systems. I continued walking, but the image of those video feeds stayed with me. That night, I found myself wondering about my own laptop, about the webcam issues I'd been experiencing, about how long Trevor had been aware of the problem before I brought the computer to his shop. On Friday, I called to check on the repair progress. Trevor said the work was taking longer than expected, that he'd discovered more extensive malware infections than initially apparent. He'd need the weekend to complete the cleaning process, but the laptop would definitely be ready by Monday. This gave me an excuse to walk past the shop again Friday evening. Same pattern as the night before, dark storefront, lights in the back office, multiple screens displaying video feeds of domestic spaces. This time, I counted at least 6 different feeds visible through the window. One of them showed a young woman in what appeared to be her bedroom, getting ready for bed. The camera angle suggested it was positioned somewhere high up, possibly hidden in the ceiling fixture or ventilation grate. She had no idea she was being watched. Another feed showed a family watching television in their living room. 2 adults, 3 children, completely unaware that their private evening was being broadcast to Trevor's monitoring setup. The camera quality was good enough to make out facial features and read text on the television screen. I realized I was looking at a surveillance operation, not a security service. These were people being watched without their knowledge or consent, probably through compromised webcams in devices they'd brought to Trevor for repair, devices like my laptop. When I collected my computer on Monday, Trevor was friendly and professional, explained that he'd removed several malware infections and updated all the security software, said the webcam issues should be completely resolved, and provided documentation of all the work he'd performed. I paid the repair fee and took the laptop home, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was fundamentally wrong with the entire situation. That evening, I covered the webcam with electrical tape and began researching how to detect covert surveillance software. The diagnostic tools I downloaded found several programs I didn't recognize, applications that weren't listed in the standard software inventory, but were definitely present on the system. Most appeared to be related to remote access and file sharing, the kind of software that could allow someone to control a computer from a distance. I spent the next several days learning about digital forensics, about how to trace network connections and monitor system activity. What I discovered was disturbing. My laptop was regularly connecting to IP addresses I didn't recognize, uploading small amounts of data at consistent intervals. The connection logs showed that these uploads had been happening for months, long before I'd taken the computer to Trevor for repair. But the frequency and volume of data transfer had increased significantly since getting the laptop back from his shop. I started documenting everything. Screenshots of the network activity, records of the suspicious software installations, photos of Trevor's shop taken from the street. Built a comprehensive file of evidence, though I wasn't sure what I planned to do with it. That's when I decided to investigate Trevor's operation more thoroughly. Started walking past his shop at different times, observing patterns in his work schedule and customer traffic. Noticed that he seemed to specialize in devices with cameras, laptops, tablets, smartphones with front-facing cameras. Most of his customers appeared to be ordinary people dealing with routine technical problems. Students with slow computers, parents with virus-infected family laptops, elderly people who'd accidentally installed malicious software, all of them trusting Trevor to fix their problems and protect their privacy. One evening, I saw something that changed my understanding of what Trevor was actually running. Through the back office window, I could see him interacting with what appeared to be a live streaming interface. Multiple video feeds were active, but now there was chat functionality alongside the video streams. People were watching the feeds and commenting in real time. Not just watching, but requesting specific actions or camera angles. Trevor was responding to these requests, apparently controlling which feeds were visible and how the surveillance was conducted. This wasn't just unauthorized monitoring. This was a commercial operation, selling access to private surveillance footage to paying customers around the world. I recognized one of the video feeds immediately. It showed a bedroom that looked exactly like mine, filmed from the angle where my laptop usually sat on the dresser. The electrical tape I'd placed over the webcam was visible in the corner of the frame, but the camera was somehow still transmitting video from inside my flat. Trevor had installed multiple surveillance devices during the repair process. The webcam issue I'd originally brought to him was probably his doing in the first place, a way to identify potential surveillance targets and get access to their devices. I left the area immediately and went home to search my flat thoroughly. Found a tiny camera hidden in the smoke detector above my bed, another one built into what looked like a standard electrical outlet near my desk. Professional installations, nearly invisible unless you knew exactly what to look for. The devices were connected to my home Wi-Fi network, probably configured during Trevor's access to my laptop and password information. They'd been broadcasting footage of my private life to his streaming platform for weeks, maybe months. I documented everything with my phone camera, then carefully removed the surveillance devices without damaging them, kept them as evidence, along with all the digital forensics information I'd gathered about the compromised laptop. But when I tried to report the situation to police, I encountered a problem I hadn't anticipated. The officers I spoke with seemed knowledgeable about traditional crimes, but struggled to understand the technical aspects of what I was describing. Digital surveillance, dark web streaming platforms, cryptocurrency payment systems. It was outside their normal area of expertise. They took my statement and collected the physical evidence, but explained that investigating this type of cybercrime would require specialist resources that might not be available immediately. Said they'd be in touch once they'd consulted with their digital forensics team. That was 4 months ago. I've heard nothing back from police, and Trevor's shop is still operating normally. Same storefront, same repair services, same trusting customers bringing their camera-equipped devices to be fixed. I moved to a different flat across town, replaced all my electronic devices, took comprehensive security precautions to prevent future surveillance. But moving doesn't change what you know, and the knowledge of what Trevor is doing follows me through every ordinary day. The worst part isn't knowing that I was watched without consent. The worst part is understanding how many other people are probably being watched right now. People who trust their local computer repair shop to fix their problems and protect their privacy. Trevor's operation depends on that trust, on people like me who need technical help and assume that small business owners are fundamentally honest, on the invisibility that comes with running a boring, everyday service that nobody pays much attention to. I've started noticing other computer repair shops around the city, wondering how many of them might be running similar operations. How many ordinary-looking technicians are actually surveillance entrepreneurs, selling access to private footage through dark web streaming platforms. Sometimes I wonder if reporting Trevor to police was the right decision, or if I should have tried to expose his operation through other means: media attention, social media campaigns, direct warnings to his potential victims. But all of these approaches would require evidence that I'm not sure I could provide without admitting to my own illegal surveillance of his activities. That's the genius of operations like Trevor's. They create witnesses who are bound by their own complicity, people who can't report what they've seen, without acknowledging their own borderline criminal behavior. I've never told anyone else about this experience. Not colleagues, not friends, not family members. What would I say? That my computer repair guy was running a surveillance operation, and I discovered it by spying on his business. That I removed hidden cameras from my own flat, but can't prove where they came from. But I'm telling you now, and I'm not entirely sure why. Maybe because the weight of keeping it secret has become too much. Maybe because sharing it might somehow make it less real, less immediate, less present in my daily thoughts. Or maybe because I've started to suspect that creating witnesses was always part of Trevor's business model. That people like me who discover what he's doing are meant to discover it. Meant to carry the knowledge forward through stories that can never be properly verified. Maybe the real product isn't just the surveillance footage, but the awareness that such surveillance is possible. The understanding that any electronic device could be compromised, that any repair technician could be more than they appear to be. Trevor is still operating his shop, still fixing computers and installing surveillance equipment, still running his streaming platform for customers around the world. And somewhere in Coventry, other people are probably walking past his storefront right now, thinking about getting their webcam issues fixed by a friendly, knowledgeable local businessman. Maybe by telling you this, I'm doing exactly what Trevor's operation requires to survive and spread. Creating awareness, planting seeds of paranoia, making people more conscious of the surveillance possibilities that exist in their ordinary digital lives. Maybe that's how these things work. Not just through the technical infrastructure of hidden cameras and streaming platforms, but through the social infrastructure of witnesses who carry the knowledge forward, who ensure that the awareness of such possibilities becomes part of the general consciousness. I still work at the primary school, still help children with their reading, still live a fundamentally ordinary life. But now I understand that ordinary life exists alongside operations like Trevor's, that the surface of everyday business conceals activities that most people never imagine are happening. And sometimes, late at night, when I'm alone in my new flat with my new laptop, I find myself wondering if Trevor was really working alone, or if he was part of something larger. A network of repair shops and surveillance operations, all feeding content to the same streaming platforms, all serving the same global audience of people who pay to watch strangers in their most private moments. That might be the most disturbing possibility of all. Not that one creepy computer repair guy was running a surveillance operation, but that such operations are common enough to sustain entire industries, entire ecosystems of people who make their living by violating the privacy of ordinary people who just needed their laptops fixed. My anxiety got so bad during my final year at university that I ended up buying medication from someone online who turned out to be much more interested in my personal life than my prescription needs. I'd always been a bit of a worrier, but something about the pressure of final exams and job applications sent my mental health completely off the rails. Panic attacks in lectures, sleepless nights staring at the ceiling, that constant feeling like something terrible was about to happen even when everything was fine. Classic anxiety symptoms that probably half the students at York were dealing with in their own ways. The obvious solution was to see a doctor and get proper medication. But the waiting list for mental health services was about 3 months long. The university counselling service was overwhelmed. Private therapy was expensive. And meanwhile, I was supposed to be writing my dissertation and applying for graduate jobs while feeling like I was having a heart attack every time someone mentioned deadlines. A friend mentioned that there were ways to get anxiety medication without going through the official channels. Nothing dodgy, she insisted. just people who could provide prescriptions for students who needed help urgently and couldn't wait for the NHS bureaucracy to catch up with demand. I was desperate enough to consider it. The panic attacks were getting worse, and I was starting to fall behind on coursework because I couldn't concentrate on anything except the constant worry that everything was going wrong. If I could just get something to take the edge off for a few weeks, maybe I could get through the final push to graduation. Finding these unofficial prescription services turned out to be easier than I'd expected. There were entire communities online dedicated to helping students and young people access medications that were difficult to obtain through conventional channels. Most operated through hidden websites that required specific addresses to access. The service I eventually contacted called itself Student Health Solutions and presented itself as a legitimate medical consultancy that specialized in providing rapid access to treatments for common student health problems. Their website looked professional, with information about qualified doctors and proper pharmaceutical suppliers. The consultation process seemed thorough and responsible. I filled out detailed forms about my medical history, symptoms, and previous treatments. I even had a video call with someone who claimed to be a qualified doctor, who asked intelligent questions about my anxiety and seemed genuinely concerned about finding appropriate treatment. The doctor explained that they could provide a short-term prescription for a mild anxiety medication that would help manage my symptoms while I waited for NHS treatment. The cost was reasonable, about £40 for a month's supply, and they guaranteed that the medication would be genuine pharmaceutical products, rather than dodgy internet pills. When the medication arrived, it was exactly as described. Proper packaging, correct labeling, even an information leaflet, with all the standard warnings and dosage instructions. I started taking it according to the prescribed schedule and found that it genuinely helped with the anxiety symptoms. For the first time in weeks, I could focus on my dissertation without constant panic about deadlines and failure. The medication didn't solve everything, but it gave me enough breathing room to function normally while I worked on getting proper support through official channels. But after about a week, I started receiving follow-up communications from Student Health Solutions that seemed oddly personal for a medical consultancy. The doctor who had conducted my initial consultation sent regular check-in emails asking not just about how the medication was working, but about my daily routine, social activities, and personal relationships. He wanted to know where I was living, who I was spending time with, even details about my family background and financial situation. When I asked why this information was relevant to my medical treatment, he explained that anxiety often had complex social and environmental causes. Understanding my complete circumstances would help him provide more effective support and identify any factors that might be contributing to my symptoms. That explanation seemed reasonable for a holistic approach to mental health care, but the questions were becoming increasingly detailed and personal, going well beyond what seemed necessary for medical purposes. He wanted to know about my daily schedule in specific detail, what time I woke up, when I had lectures, where I ate meals, what route I took walking around campus. He asked about my relationships with flatmates, whether I felt safe in my accommodation, if I'd had any problems with other students or university staff. Most concerning were questions about my family's financial situation, my employment prospects after graduation, and whether I had any valuable possessions or access to money that might help with ongoing treatment costs. I started to suspect that the medical consultation was being used as cover for gathering information that had nothing to do with providing healthcare. When I tried to research Student Health Solutions more thoroughly, I found very little information about the organization beyond their professional-looking website. No registration with medical regulatory bodies, no physical address beyond a PO box, no verifiable credentials for the staff who claimed to be qualified doctors. The medication itself was genuine, but that didn't necessarily mean the people providing it were legitimate medical professionals. I decided to stop responding to the follow-up questions and just focus on using the medication I'd already received. But the communications from Student Health Solutions became more persistent and concerning. The supposed doctor started expressing worry about my mental health based on my reduced communication. He suggested that isolation and withdrawal were signs that my anxiety was getting worse and that I needed more intensive support than just medication. He offered to arrange in-person consultations at locations around York, claiming that face-to-face assessment would allow him to provide more effective treatment. When I declined, he seemed genuinely concerned that I was putting my health at risk by avoiding professional medical support. But he also started demonstrating knowledge about my activities that he couldn't have gained through our online communications. He mentioned seeing me around campus in specific locations, knew which coffee shops I'd been visiting, even referenced conversations I'd had with friends that he couldn't possibly have overheard, unless he'd been deliberately monitoring my activities. It was becoming clear that Student Health Solutions wasn't just providing informal medical consultations. They were using healthcare as a pretext for systematic surveillance of vulnerable students. I tried to research other people who might have used their services, looking for reviews or discussions about their treatment experiences. What I found was more disturbing than I'd expected. There were scattered reports from students who had received medication from similar services, but had subsequently experienced problems that seemed unrelated to their original health concerns. Identity theft, burglary, even stalking incidents that had started shortly after they provided personal information during medical consultations. Most concerning were cases where students had become dependent on their unofficial medication suppliers, unable to transition to legitimate NHS treatment because their informal providers had created complex psychological relationships that were difficult to break. Some students reported that their supposed doctors had gradually increased their involvement in personal decision-making, offering advice about relationships, career choices, and financial management that went far beyond medical treatment, creating dependent relationships where vulnerable young people relied on their medication providers for guidance about all aspects of their lives. I realized I was potentially being targeted by people who used fake medical services to identify and exploit vulnerable students. The anxiety medication was probably genuine, but it was being used as bait to establish relationships with young people who were dealing with mental health problems and might be susceptible to manipulation and control. I stopped taking the medication immediately and tried to cut all contact with Student Health Solutions. But they continued sending communications expressing concern about my welfare and offering various types of support that seemed designed to maintain some form of relationship. When I ignored their emails, they started using text messages and phone calls. The supposed doctor claimed he was worried about my mental health and felt professionally responsible for ensuring I received appropriate care. But the calls often came at times when I was alone in specific locations, suggesting that my activities were still being monitored, despite my attempts to end our professional relationship. Most disturbing was evidence that they had detailed information about my financial situation, academic performance, and family circumstances that I'd never provided during the original consultation. They knew about my student loan balance, my parents' occupations, even my employment prospects after graduation. Someone had been conducting comprehensive background research into my personal life, using information that could only have been gathered through systematic surveillance or unauthorized access to official records. I started taking precautions around my daily routine, varying my schedule and being more careful about sharing personal information. But I also began to suspect that the surveillance had been going on much longer than I'd realized. Looking back at the original consultation process, I could see signs that Student Health Solutions had already known significant details about my circumstances before I'd contacted them. The questions they'd asked had been designed to confirm information they already possessed, rather than genuinely learning about my medical history. They had somehow identified me as a potential target before I'd even been aware that services like theirs existed. The friend who had recommended them might have been unknowingly part of a recruitment process designed to connect vulnerable students with people who specialized in exploiting their mental health problems. I tried contacting the friend who had originally mentioned the service, hoping to understand how she'd learned about them and whether she'd experienced similar problems. But she claimed not to remember giving me their details and seemed uncomfortable discussing anything related to unofficial healthcare services. When I pressed her for more information, she suggested that I might be confused about where I'd heard about Student Health Solutions, and that maybe my anxiety was causing me to misremember recent events. Her response made me wonder whether she was genuinely confused or whether she'd been instructed to distance herself from the organization if anyone started asking awkward questions about how they recruited new clients. Either way, it was clear that I wasn't going to get help understanding the situation from people who had been involved in directing me towards Student Health Solutions in the first place. I considered reporting everything to the police, but explaining the situation would require admitting that I'd obtained prescription medication through illegal channels. Even if the people providing it were running some kind of fraud or surveillance operation, I could potentially be charged with obtaining controlled substances without proper medical supervision. The legal risks of reporting the problem might be worse than the risks of simply trying to avoid further contact with the organization. But I also knew that other students were probably being targeted through similar schemes, and that the surveillance and manipulation tactics I'd experienced were likely being used against more vulnerable people who might be less able to recognize what was happening to them. Students dealing with serious mental health problems would be particularly susceptible to people who offered medical help while gradually gaining control over their personal lives and decision-making processes. I started monitoring online communities where students discussed mental health and informal healthcare options, looking for other people who might have encountered Student Health Solutions or similar organizations. What I found was a pattern of reports from students who had received medication or treatment from unofficial providers, but had subsequently experienced various forms of harassment, exploitation, or identity theft. Most of these students had been in vulnerable situations when they'd first sought help, dealing with mental health crises, financial problems, or academic difficulties that made them desperate enough to consider alternatives to official support services. The fake medical providers had used their initial healthcare consultations to identify students who were isolated, financially insecure, or struggling with personal problems that made them susceptible to manipulation. Once they'd established relationships with vulnerable targets, they'd gradually expanded their involvement in those students' lives, offering various forms of support and guidance that created psychological dependence while gathering information that could be used for financial fraud or other criminal purposes. Some students had lost significant amounts of money to people who had gained their trust by providing medical help during mental health crises. Others had experienced identity theft, stalking, or harassment that had started after they'd shared personal information during fake medical consultations. The most disturbing cases involve students who had become completely dependent on their unofficial healthcare providers, unable to function independently because they'd been systematically isolated from legitimate support systems and convinced that only their fake doctors could provide effective treatment. I realized that Student Health Solutions was probably part of a larger operation that specialized in identifying and exploiting vulnerable young people through fake medical and support services. they used legitimate seeming healthcare provision as a way to establish relationships with targets who were dealing with mental health problems, financial difficulties, or other vulnerabilities that made them susceptible to manipulation and control. The genuine medication they provided was just the initial hook used to establish trust and credibility. Once they'd gained access to their targets' personal lives, they could exploit that access for various criminal purposes while maintaining the appearance of being helpful healthcare providers. But understanding the scheme didn't necessarily protect me from its consequences. I'd already provided them with extensive personal information and had demonstrated that I was dealing with mental health problems that might make me a valuable long-term target. Even if I avoided further direct contact with Student Health Solutions, the information they'd gathered about me could be used for identity theft, fraud, or sold to other criminals who specialized in targeting vulnerable individuals. The surveillance of my daily activities was probably continuing, and the people behind the organization might decide that I posed a security risk if they suspected I was planning to expose their operations. I was trapped in a situation where seeking help for mental health problems had made me a target for criminals who specialized in exploiting people with exactly the vulnerabilities I'd been trying to address. The medication that was supposed to help me manage anxiety had instead created a much more serious and long-term threat to my safety and independence. And somewhere out there, other students were probably going through the same process, reaching out for help with mental health problems and unknowingly providing criminals with everything they needed to systematically destroy their lives. I found a website where people traded unusual cooking recipes, but some of the ingredients they were discussing definitely weren't meant for food. Cooking has always been my way of dealing with stress. Growing up in a chaotic household where money was tight and meal times were unpredictable, I learned early that being able to make something good from basic ingredients was both practical and therapeutic. When everything else felt out of control, I could at least create something nourishing and satisfying in the kitchen. That skill became even more valuable when I moved to Manchester for university. While my flatmates survived on takeaways and ready meals, I enjoyed experimenting with recipes that could transform cheap ingredients into proper meals. It was economical and relaxing. Plus, it gave me something to focus on, besides the stress of assignments and money worries. I started looking online for recipe ideas that would work with student budgets and limited kitchen equipment. Most cooking websites were aimed at people with more money and space than university accommodation provided, but I eventually found communities dedicated to creative cooking with minimal resources. These communities were exactly what I'd been looking for. People sharing techniques for making interesting meals from supermarket basics, tips for stretching expensive ingredients, and recipes that could be adapted based on what was available and affordable. I contributed some of my own discoveries and gradually became part of regular discussions about cooking techniques, ingredient substitutions, and creative approaches to meal planning on tight budgets. But after participating in these communities for a few months, I started noticing conversations that seemed to go beyond normal cooking advice. Some members discussed ingredients that I couldn't identify, using terminology that didn't match anything in cookbooks or standard culinary references. When I asked about these unfamiliar items, other members would explain that they were specialized ingredients available through particular suppliers who catered to experimental cooks. The descriptions of these specialty ingredients were vague and often contradictory. Some were described as enhancing flavors in ways that seemed impossible, while others were supposed to have effects on people who consumed them that sounded more medicinal than culinary. I started paying closer attention to the recipe discussions and noticed that some members seemed to be sharing information about much more than just cooking techniques. Recipes that included detailed instructions about timing, dosages, and effects that would be experienced by people who ate the prepared dishes. Discussions about how to mask unusual tastes or textures so that diners wouldn't notice they were consuming something other than normal food. Most concerning were conversations about sourcing ingredients that couldn't be obtained through normal suppliers. Members shared information about vendors who operated through hidden websites and specialized in providing materials that weren't available through standard cooking channels. When I tried to research some of the ingredients being discussed, I found that many had no connection to legitimate culinary uses. Some were industrial chemicals, others were substances with pharmaceutical properties, and a few were materials that appeared to be completely toxic if consumed. I realized that the cooking community had been infiltrated by people who were using recipe sharing as a cover for discussing how to poison or drug others without detection. The detailed discussions about preparation methods, timing, and effects weren't about cooking at all. They were instructions for administering harmful substances to unsuspecting victims through food and drink. But the legitimate cooking discussions continued alongside these more sinister exchanges, making it difficult to distinguish between genuine recipe sharing and systematic planning of harm against innocent people. Some members seemed genuinely unaware that they were participating in a community that facilitated poisoning and drugging. They continued sharing normal recipes and cooking advice while unknowingly providing cover for criminal activities. Others were clearly aware of the dual purpose of the community and used coded language to discuss harmful activities while maintaining plausible deniability about their intentions. When I tried to report my concerns to the website administrators, I found that there were no obvious contact methods or oversight mechanisms for addressing problematic content. The community operated through platforms that prioritized anonymity and unrestricted sharing, making it nearly impossible to identify the people responsible for criminal discussions or hold them accountable for facilitating harm. I attempted to research whether law enforcement was aware of communities that used cooking discussions to share information about poisoning and drugging methods. What I found was that food-related crimes were difficult to detect and prosecute because they often appeared to be accidents or natural illnesses rather than deliberate attacks. Victims rarely suspected that their symptoms had been caused by consuming contaminated food, especially when prepared by people they trusted. The cooking communities provided perfect cover for sharing harmful techniques because the discussions appeared innocuous to casual observers and were mixed with legitimate culinary content that made suspicious activities harder to identify. People seeking normal cooking advice were unknowingly providing cover for criminal networks that specialized in food-based attacks against victims who would never suspect that their illnesses had been deliberately caused. But understanding the true nature of these communities didn't immediately resolve my situation. I'd been participating in discussions that included both legitimate cooking advice and criminal instruction sharing, potentially making me appear complicit in facilitating harmful activities. The detailed information I'd shared about my cooking habits, ingredient preferences, and kitchen setup could be used to assess my potential value as someone who could prepare harmful substances without attracting suspicion. When I tried to withdraw from the communities entirely, several members contacted me expressing disappointment about my reduced participation and offering to share more specialized recipes that weren't discussed in public channels. These private communications included invitations to join exclusive groups that focused on what they called advanced cooking techniques for people who were serious about experimental cuisine. The descriptions of these advanced techniques made it clear that they involved preparing substances intended to harm or incapacitate people who consumed them, with detailed instructions about avoiding detection and managing the effects. I was being recruited to participate directly in criminal activities that would make me responsible for poisoning innocent victims who trusted me to prepare safe food for them. But declining these invitations might not be sufficient to avoid continued recruitment pressure or retaliation from people who considered me a potential security risk because of what I'd learned about their activities. The cooking skills that I developed as a way to manage stress and create something positive had instead made me a target for people who specialized in using food as a weapon against unsuspecting victims. Meanwhile, the recipe-sharing communities continued operating and growing, attracting new members who were seeking normal cooking advice but unknowingly joining platforms that facilitated systematic poisoning and drugging operations. People who just wanted to learn how to cook better meals were being gradually exposed to criminal techniques and assessed for their potential willingness to participate in food-based attacks against others. The legitimate cooking discussions provided perfect cover for recruiting accomplices who would have access to kitchens, ingredient suppliers, and trusted relationships with potential victims who would never suspect that their meals had been deliberately contaminated. I stopped participating in all online cooking communities and avoided sharing recipes or cooking advice through any digital platforms. But the knowledge I'd gained about how these communities operated made it impossible to trust any online food-related discussions. Every recipe-sharing website, cooking community, and culinary advice platform potentially contained people who were using legitimate cooking interests as cover for planning attacks against innocent victims. The most disturbing realization was that this recruitment method was probably being used to target people in other communities as well. Any hobby or interest that involved preparing things for others to consume could be infiltrated by criminals looking for unwitting accomplices. Homebrewing communities, baking groups, even gardening discussions about growing herbs and vegetables might contain people who were sharing information about producing harmful substances while appearing to pursue innocent hobbies. After I'd stopped all participation in cooking communities, I received a package containing several unmarked containers of powder, along with detailed recipes for incorporating the substances into common baked goods and instructions for observing and documenting the effects on people who consumed the prepared items. People always ask how someone like me ended up in this situation. I suppose it's fair to wonder how a university cleaner from Brighton could stumble onto something so dark that thousands of people are now eagerly waiting to watch me suffer. The answer is embarrassingly simple. I thought I was being helpful. It was about 4 months ago when I first heard about live streaming. My daughter had moved to Leeds for university, and we'd been struggling to stay in touch. She suggested we try some new platform where she could show me around her campus and I could give her virtual tours of home. I'm not great with technology, but I wanted to connect with her, so I signed up. The platform was called Streamlink, and it seemed straightforward enough. You could broadcast live to friends and family, or watch other people's streams if they made them public. I spent my first few weeks just watching travel vlogs and people cooking meals in their kitchens. Harmless stuff, the kind of content that made the internet feel like a friendlier place. I work night shifts, cleaning office buildings around Brighton. It's solitary work, which suits me fine, but it does get lonely sometimes. During my breaks, I'd watch these streams on my phone. People chatting while they worked, students showing their daily routines, families having dinner together. It felt like having company during the long, quiet hours. One night, I was cleaning a legal firm's offices when I received a notification that someone wanted to follow my account. The username was just a string of numbers and letters, but their profile showed they were interested in workplace environments. I accepted the follow request without thinking much about it. Probably someone else who worked night shifts, I figured. The next night, I got a message from the same account asking if I'd ever considered streaming during my work. They said they found workplace content relaxing and would be interested in watching someone clean offices. The message was polite, even complimentary about how peaceful night cleaning must be. They offered to pay me £20 per stream. £20 doesn't sound like much, but when you're on minimum wage and trying to help your daughter with university expenses, it's significant. I was hesitant at first. Streaming while working seemed unprofessional. But then I reasoned that I was only cleaning, and the buildings were empty anyway. What harm could there be? I started with short streams, maybe 30 minutes, while I cleaned reception areas or break rooms. My one regular viewer seemed genuinely interested, making comments about cleaning techniques and asking questions about different office layouts. They were respectful, never asking personal questions or trying to get me to show anything inappropriate. Just someone who found routine, methodical work soothing to watch. After a few weeks, they asked if I'd be willing to stream while cleaning higher security areas, places like server rooms or document storage. They offered £50 per stream and explained they worked in office security and were interested in how cleaning staff navigated around sensitive equipment. The request seemed reasonable, and the money was too good to refuse. That's when things started feeling off. During these streams, my viewer would make very specific comments about the equipment I was near, or ask me to clean certain areas more thoroughly. Once, they asked me to focus the camera on a particular server rack while I worked around it. Another time, they wanted me to spend extra time near a filing cabinet marked confidential. I started noticing other changes too. My viewer count occasionally showed 2 or 3 people watching instead of just one, though only my original follower ever commented. Sometimes I'd catch glimpses of unfamiliar usernames in the viewer list before they'd disappear. I told myself it was just a glitch in the platform. The requests grew more specific. Could I stream while cleaning the partners' offices? Could I make sure to clean around their desks thoroughly, showing any documents that might be left out? Could I adjust the camera angle to get a better view of computer screens that had been left on? Each request came with an increased payment offer. I should have stopped then, should have realized what was really happening. But the money was too useful, and I convinced myself I wasn't doing anything truly wrong. I wasn't stealing documents or accessing computers. I was just cleaning, and if people wanted to watch me do my job, that was their choice. One night, about 6 weeks ago, everything changed. I was streaming while cleaning a law firm's conference room when I noticed something odd about the viewer count. Instead of the usual 2 or 3, it showed dozens of people watching, then hundreds, then thousands. The chat, which had always been just my one regular viewer making polite comments, exploded with activity. Messages were flying by too fast to read, but I caught fragments, coordinates, building layouts, security schedules. Someone was discussing the best times to enter the building. Another was sharing information about alarm systems. That's when I understood what my streams had really been used for. I wasn't providing relaxing content for lonely night shift workers. I was unknowingly conducting reconnaissance for criminals. Every office layout I'd shown, every security camera I'd inadvertently revealed, every keypad code I'd accidentally captured while unlocking doors, it had all been recorded and analyzed. I ended the stream immediately and tried to delete my account, but the platform wouldn't let me. Every time I attempted to log in, I received error messages. When I tried to create a new account to see what was happening, I found that my streams had been archived and were still available to view. My cleaning routes through multiple office buildings had been documented in detail. 2 days later, I received an email to my personal account from an address I didn't recognize. The subject line was just my full name. The body contained a single link and the words, "You've been very helpful. Now it's time to give back to the community." The link led to a different website, not Streamlink, but something darker. The page showed what appeared to be a live feed from an empty room. Concrete walls, industrial lighting, a drain in the floor. In the corner was a viewer counter that showed thousands of people watching. Below that was a countdown timer, set to 3 days from then. I closed the browser and tried to pretend I'd never seen it. But over the next day, I kept receiving messages, text messages to my phone, which I'd never given to anyone associated with the platform. Emails to addresses I'd only used for personal things. Social media accounts I thought were private suddenly had friend requests from users with random number usernames. The messages all carried the same theme. I'd provided valuable services, and now I needed to fulfill my part of a larger agreement, an agreement I'd never knowingly made. They referenced specific details from my streams, which office building I was in on which nights, what time I usually took my breaks, even what I typically ate for my midnight meal. I went to the police, but explaining the situation made me sound paranoid or potentially complicit in whatever crimes were being planned. A middle-aged cleaner claiming he'd accidentally helped criminals through innocent live streams. They took a report, but clearly thought I was either confused or trying to cover up involvement in something illegal. That's when the physical surveillance began. People following me to work, cars parked outside my flat, strangers in the cleaning supply store who seemed to know my schedule. One morning, I came home to find my front door unlocked and a note on my kitchen table with just an address and the word tomorrow. The address was for a warehouse on the outskirts of Brighton. I didn't go, obviously. Instead, I packed what I could carry and left town. I've been moving from place to place since then, staying in different guest houses and hostels, paying cash for everything. But they keep finding me. Hotel staff who recognize me despite using different names. Other guests who seem to know my routines. Maintenance workers who ask unusual questions about the buildings I'm staying in. Sometimes I'll return to my room to find that someone has been through my belongings, though nothing is ever taken. Yesterday, I found a small package in my backpack that I definitely didn't put there. Inside was a mobile phone, already switched on. The screen showed a familiar interface, Streamlink, with a notification that I had thousands of followers waiting for my next broadcast. There was also a countdown timer showing less than 2 days remaining. I'm writing this from an internet cafe in a town whose name I won't mention. The mobile phone is still with me because I'm afraid to throw it away. Every time I look at it, the follower count has increased. The comments section is active with messages I can't understand, references to locations, schedules, preparation. This morning, the phone rang. When I answered, there was no voice on the other end, just the sound of a streaming platform notification. Then text appeared on the screen. Final stream begins in 36 hours. Location details to follow. Failure to participate will result in consequences for family members. I haven't spoken to my daughter in Leeds for 3 weeks. I've been too afraid to contact her, worried that doing so might draw attention to her. But this morning, I received a photo message on the mysterious phone. It showed her walking to lectures, clearly taken without her knowledge. She looked tired and stressed. probably worried about not hearing from me. The most terrifying realization is that this was always the plan. The initial approach, the gradual increase in payment, the specific requests for certain areas, it was all designed to gather information while slowly drawing me deeper into something I couldn't escape from. They'd studied my financial situation, my relationship with my daughter, my work schedule. They knew exactly how to manipulate me. I keep thinking about how many other people might be involved in similar schemes without realizing it. Delivery drivers streaming their routes, security guards showing empty buildings at night, maintenance workers broadcasting from inside restricted areas, all thinking they're earning a bit of extra money through harmless content creation, not realizing they're providing reconnaissance for something much darker. The phone just vibrated with another notification. The stream is scheduled to begin tomorrow evening at a location that will be sent to me 6 hours beforehand. The viewer count now shows tens of thousands of people waiting, people who have been watching my every move for months, learning my routines, studying my vulnerabilities. I don't know what kind of stream they expect me to participate in, but given what I've learned about the platform's true purpose, I doubt it's anything I'd survive. The empty room with the concrete walls and the drain in the floor keeps appearing in my nightmares. I'm going to try to disappear again after posting this. Maybe if I can stay hidden long enough, they'll lose interest. Maybe they'll find another target. Maybe my daughter will be safe if I just vanish completely. But I'm not optimistic. They've proven they can track me anywhere, through any means. They have resources I can't understand and reach I can't escape. And they have something that makes escape impossible: leverage over the people I care about. If you ever get approached to start streaming your work, no matter how innocent it seems, please think carefully about what you might inadvertently be revealing. The people watching might not be who they claim to be. The request might seem reasonable at first, but lead somewhere much darker. The countdown on the phone now shows less than 30 hours. I need to move again, but I'm running out of places to hide, and running out of hope that I can somehow break free from this nightmare I accidentally created. One innocent stream led to this. One decision to earn a bit of extra money has put me and my daughter in danger. All because I wanted to help someone who claimed to find workplace cleaning relaxing to watch. The viewer count keeps growing. They're all waiting for tomorrow's final stream, waiting to see what happens to the helpful cleaner who showed them exactly how to break into the buildings where he worked. I should never have accepted that first follow request.